She laughed at his motorcycle, stood there in her tailored coat, surrounded by executives and cameras, and laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is that thing even street legal?" she said. The crowd chuckled. Nobody pushed back. Nobody defended him. Caleb Mercer didn't even stand up. He stayed crouched on the cold asphalt, tying his 7-year-old daughter's shoelace, while the most powerful woman in the building mocked everything he'd ridden in on. Brielle Sutton didn't know what nobody in that parking lot knew, was that underneath the scratched seat of that ugly, beat-up motorcycle sat the invention that built her entire empire. If you're new here, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end because this story goes places you won't see coming. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The alarm went off at 5:42. 5:45:42, because Sadie needed exactly 3 minutes of slow waking before she'd come out of sleep without crying, and Caleb had learned that the hard way about 2 years after Elena died. 3 minutes. Any less and she'd jolt up disoriented, sometimes calling for her mother, which was the kind of thing that could knock the whole morning sideways before it even started. He lay there in the dark, listening to the alarm, then killed it and rolled to the edge of the mattress. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom that had a faucet with a slow drip no matter how many times he replaced the washer, a kitchen that faced a parking structure, a living room where Sadie had pushed the coffee table against the wall so she'd have floor space to draw. Her drawings were everywhere taped to the refrigerator, folded into his work jacket pockets, left on the bathroom counter, like little morning gifts. A dinosaur wearing a tutu, a house with a sun that had a face, a motorcycle with a name written underneath it in uneven 7-year-old letters, Old Betty. Caleb patted down the short hallway in his socks and pushed Sadie's door open just enough to check. She was still out, one arm thrown as doorstep off rabbit, hair fanned across the pillow. He watched her breathe for a moment. That was a habit he hadn't been able to shake since the accident. Just watching her breathe. He started the coffee. While it ran, he went to the bathroom, splashed into his face, but studied himself for a moment in the mirror like a man reviewing damage. He was 32, but some mornings the mirror reflected something older, not in the lines exactly, more in the weight behind the eyes. He wasn't unhappy. That was the thing people got wrong when they looked at his life. He wasn't defeated. He'd made a choice and he understood the cost of it, and most days he was at peace with that. His days. He poured his coffee into the thermos, packed Sadie's lunch, peanut butter and honey, crusts cut off, apple slices, the small bag of pretzels she liked, and set it by the front door beside her backpack. He went and stood in her doorway again. "Sades," he said quietly. 3-minute warning. She stirred. "I don't want to wake up," she said, to no one in particular. 3 minutes. He went back to the kitchen. Drank his coffee, standing at the counter, watching nothing, the way people do in the early morning when their brain is still loading. On the counter beside the toaster sat a small framed photograph, Elena laughing at something off camera, her hair pulled back, holding an infant Sadie against her chest, with the casual confidence of a woman who didn't know the photo was being taken. It was the best picture he had of her. He'd almost never cried looking at it anymore, which he thought was probably healthy, though he wasn't entirely sure. By 6:15, Sadie was at the table eating cereal, still in her pajamas, hair going in 3 directions, her rabbit sitting in the chair beside her. "You can't bring him to school," Caleb said, nodding at the rabbit. She didn't sound bothered. "He just likes to eat breakfast with me." "Makes sense. Dad, can old Betty get a new paint job?" "Old Betty runs fine. She looks sad." "She's not sad. She's experienced." Sadie considered this, chewing. "Can experienced things also be sad?" He looked at his daughter, 7 years old and already asking the kinds of questions that had no clean answers. "Sometimes," he said. "Yeah." Redwood Dynamics occupied a long industrial campus on the eastern edge of the city, 3 manufacturing facilities connected by covered walkways, an administrative building with glass panels that reflected the sky, a sprawling parking lot that was always organized by rank in a way nobody officially acknowledged, but everyone understood. Senior executives near the main entrance, management in the middle tier, workers and technicians along the far perimeter, where the lighting was worse and the pavement was older. Caleb parked old Betty at the end of the second row from the fence, which was where he always parked. He'd been parking there for 4 years. The spot had a crack in the asphalt that ran in the shape of a backward L, and on cold mornings, like this, one frost collected in the crack and caught the light a certain way that Caleb had always thought was quietly beautiful, though he'd never mentioned that to anyone. He swung off the bike, set his helmet on the seat, and started toward the entrance. He heard them before he saw them. A car door, multiple voices, heels on pavement, the specific sound of a large group moving together with purpose, that compressed, tightly orbiting energy that surrounds people who are always being watched. Brielle Sutton stepped out of a black SUV wearing a charcoal wool coat and the kind of calm expression that looks like control, but is really just practiced. She was 30 years old, which Caleb knew the way all employees know things about the person who signs the company's charter. She'd inherited Redwood from her father at 24, which sounded like a fairy tale until you looked closer and saw what the company had been when she took it bleeding money, key talent walking out, a board that didn't trust her and wasn't quiet about it. She'd spent 6 years quietly reversing all of that. Caleb had no strong feelings about her one way or the other. She was the owner of the company he worked for. She existed on a different floor of the building and in a different hemisphere of concern. He'd seen her maybe 4 times in 4 years. He was walking toward the entrance when he heard her voice carry across the lot. "Is that actually parked here?" He slowed without stopping. One of the women beside Brielle, her assistant, Caleb thought, or maybe someone from communications, followed her gaze to where old Betty sat at the end of the row. "Looks like it," the assistant said. "Does it run?" Brielle said. A few people laughed. Not cruel exactly, but not kind either. The easy, reflexive laughter of people who want the most powerful person nearby to know they're on her side. "Barely, I'd assume," said a man Caleb recognized from marketing. His name was Preston something. He was the type who wore Italian shoes to a factory campus. Tilted her head, the coat shifted. "I hope whoever owns it has a bus pass as backup." Another ripple of laughter. It's amazing how someone can be proud of something like that. Caleb stopped, not to confront her. He hadn't made the decision to stop. His feet had just stopped. He was standing about 20 feet away, which was close enough that a few people in the group had noticed him, though Brielle hadn't yet. He was aware of a familiar pull, the thing that used to live in his chest in the old days, the engineer's compulsive need to explain and defend and correct. That motorcycle contains a prototype that your company licensed. That algorithm in your flagship product traced back to work I did in a garage at 2 in the morning while my wife checked the math and my daughter slept in a second-hand crib 6 feet away. He didn't say any of that. He crouched down instead. Sadie was standing beside him. She'd slipped her hand into his at some point without him noticing, which was a thing she still did when new environments made her uncertain, and one of her shoes had come untied. On the cold pavement of the parking lot and started unting the lace. "The double knot," Sadie said. "So it doesn't come loose again." He said, "I'm doing the double knot." He was aware of the group passing nearby. He didn't look up. He focused on the lace and his daughter's shoe and the texture of the cold asphalt under his knee. "Your bow needs to be tighter before the second loop," he told Sadie. "Otherwise, it'll work loose again no matter how many times you tie it. Can you show me?" "Yeah. Watch," he showed her. She practiced it once. He stood up. The group had moved on. Brielle Sutton was halfway to the entrance, her back to the parking lot, already talking to someone about something else. The man from marketing glanced back once, and then looked quickly away. Caleb picked up his bag and walked in. The maintenance bay at Redwood smelled like motor oil and circuit boards and, inexplicably, coffee, probably because someone had spilled an entire pot near the east workbench 3 years ago, and the smell had just become part of the building's personality. Caleb had a corner station near the rear exit that he'd organized exactly the way he liked it. Tools sorted by category and frequency of use, not by size, which was the only system that actually made sense. A battered clipboard on a hook, a photograph of Sadie taped to the side of the cabinet, right at eye level, so he'd see her when he reached for a wrench. He was running diagnostics on a conveyor system sensor when Graham Holloway appeared at the edge of his station. Graham was 61, a veteran mechanical engineer who'd been with Redwood since before Brielle's father had built the current facility. He had the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of industrial work, not unkind, but serious in a permanent way, like a man who'd learned that most surprises are bad ones. He and Caleb had developed a quiet friendship over the past 4 years that was built less on personal disclosure and more on mutual technical respect. And Graham would bring Caleb engineering problems that stumped him, and Caleb would solve them and never ask for credit. And Graham would say, "Thought so," and they'd go back to work. It functioned. Graham set a folder on Caleb's workbench. He didn't say anything. He just set it there and looked at it, then looked at Caleb. Caleb studied him for a moment. Graham had the expression of a man delivering something he'd been debating delivering for weeks. "What's this?" "Take a look," Graham said, "and keep it down." Caleb opened the folder. Inside were internal documents, product specifications, system architecture summaries, a preliminary patent framework. The project was labeled Project Meridian. Redwood's upcoming motorcycle launch, the one that had been generating internal buzz for the past several months. The flagship product, the one that Brielle had apparently staked the company's next era on. He flipped past the overview pages. The technical documentation was detailed component lists, sensor specifications, algorithm frameworks. He read at the pace he always read technical material, which was fast with the specific kind of absorption that meant he was actually processing, rather than skimming. He turned a page, then another. He stopped. He read a specific paragraph 3 times. Then he set the document down on the workbench very carefully, like he was handling something that might break or detonate. "Graham," he said. His voice came out level, which surprised him. "Where did you get this?" "Quality review meeting," Graham said. "I was brought in as an outside technical consultant. Reviewed the full specs." He paused. "I recognized it." "You recognized it. I worked alongside you for 2 years in the old division before you transferred out, Caleb. I know your work." The fluorescent light above them buzzed once, a flicker, then settled. "The adaptive torque distribution system," Caleb said. "All of it, the primary algorithm structure. The sensor configuration, that 3-point layout you were testing. The activation threshold calibration." Graham pushed his glasses up his nose. "I thought maybe I was wrong. I went home and I pulled up some notes I'd kept from those days, things I jotted down from when you were working through the early theory." "Matched," Caleb. "It's not similar, it's your system." Caleb looked at the document again. He thought about a garage, a folding table covered in graph paper. Elena cross-legged on a cooler they'd repurposed as a stool, calling out measurements while he calibrated the sensor array. It was January. He remembered the cold, remembered being able to see their breath, remembered Sadie's baby monitor sitting next to the laptop because they'd needed the space for the prototype and couldn't be far from her at night. He remembered the exact moment the system first ran clean, the data coming back without error, and Elena grabbing his arm and saying, "There it is. That's it." That's what voice pitched higher than she meant it, surprised by her own excitement. He remembered all of that very clearly. "His name is everywhere," Caleb said. He was looking at Derek Vaughn's name in the documentation, credited as the project's originating engineer. "Derek filed the original development claim 4 years ago," Graham said. 2 months after you transferred to maintenance." 2 months. Caleb had been in the middle of settling in his estate, figuring out child care, learning how to get a 2-year-old to eat food that wasn't applesauce, trying to remember to pay the electric bill. He'd been operating in the specific fog of early grief where functioning at 40% capacity feels like heroism. "He told me it would be credited properly," Caleb said. "When the project was mature enough." He said there was a process. Graham made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "There wasn't a process," Caleb said. Graham said there wasn't. Caleb closed the folder. "What's under old Betty's seat?" he said. Graham frowned. "The motorcycle you ride in on?" "The original prototype. Still functional. Hand-stamped with my initials and the build date." He paused. "I never took it out because I kept thinking, eventually Derek would do the right thing, or someone would notice, or it wouldn't matter because I had other things to deal with." He looked at the folder. "I have the notebooks too. All of them. Elena's handwriting is in half the calculation pages." Graham was quiet for a moment. "The patent filing," he said. "They're pushing it through in the next few weeks." "Caleb, I know," he said again. He picked up his clipboard. He set it back down. He was doing the math, not technical math, but the other kind. The kind where you try to calculate what a decision will cost before you make it. He thought about Sadie at the breakfast table with her rabbit. He thought about the photograph of Elena in the kitchen. He thought about the way Brielle Sutton had stood in the parking lot and laughed at the motorcycle that carried the evidence of everything that had been taken from him. He picked the folder up again and slid it back across to Graham. "Can you get me a name?" he said. "Someone in legal. Someone who isn't in Derek's pocket." Graham thought about it. "Me Pierce," he said. "IP counsel. She came in 18 months ago. She's not from the old guard." "Can you get me a meeting?" "I can try." "Don't try," Caleb said, and his voice had something in it that hadn't been there a few minutes ago. Anger. Something quieter and harder than anger. "Get me a meeting." He picked Sadie up at 3:58. She was standing outside the school entrance in her purple jacket, backpack hanging off one shoulder. Something very long and involved to her friend Maya, who was not at each point with the earnest focus of a person at a business meeting. When Sadie spotted Caleb, her whole face shifted, not a polite shift, a complete one, the kind of expression only children produce because adults spend years learning to moderate it. She ran, ran, full speed, backpack bouncing. "Dad!" He caught her with his free arm half spinning from the momentum. She was getting heavier. She'd probably think it was funny if he told her that. "How was it?" he asked. "We did fractions." "Yeah, how are fractions treating you?" She pulled back and made a face. "They're rude." He laughed, actually laughed, from the stomach. "Fair enough. Miss Dillon says once you understand them, they become your friends. But I don't think that's going to happen. Give it time. Fractions come around eventually." She took his hand as they walked to where old Betty was parked, at the edge of the school lot. Sadie had been riding with him since she was 3, always properly helmeted, always in the sidecar he'd built, and fitted with its own harness system, designed with the kind of obsessive engineering attention that came from being both a father and someone who knew exactly how mechanical systems failed. The sidecar was solid. He'd tested it to tolerances most manufacturers wouldn't bother with. Sadie climbed in and pulled her helmet on, then looked up at him. "You okay?" she said. 7 years old, and she asked him that. Has been asking him that since she was about 5, in the straightforward way children do when they haven't yet learned to edit what they notice. He said, "Long day. Did something happen?" "Nothing bad." He buckled her harness. "Just some things I have to think through." "Work?" "Yeah." She settled back. "You always figure things out," she said. It wasn't flattery. It was the uncomplicated confidence of a child who'd watched her father fix enough broken things to believe he could fix most things. He didn't correct her. He started the motorcycle, checked his mirrors, pulled out of the school lot onto the street. The engine knocked once on the first pull, caught on the second, and settled into its characteristic low rumble that Caleb had always found unreasonably comforting. They stopped at the grocery store. Sadie chose the cereal, the one with the cartoon on the box, which he's let her have, because there were battles worth picking. He bought pasta and canned tomatoes and 2 apples and a newspaper he wasn't sure why he'd grabbed, probably habit. After dinner, after homework, after Sadie's bath, and the 15-minute routine of getting her actually into bed with the light off, rather than reading under her blanket with the flashlight, Caleb sat at the kitchen table. He pulled out a cardboard box he'd had under his bed for 4 years. Books, a hard drive, a USB stick, printed photographs of the prototype at various stages of development, emails between him and Derek from the early development period before everything turned. A handwritten note on redwood letterhead, Derek's handwriting, Caleb's name, a sentence that said Caleb's contributions will be formally documented once the project reaches the commercialization stage. He read that sentence twice. Then he set it down next to the stack of notebooks. He'd kept all of it because he'd told himself at the time he wasn't sure what he'd need later. The more honest answer was probably that he hadn't been able to throw it away, because throwing it away would have meant accepting that it was over, that the work was just gone, that Elena's nights in that cold garage had become someone else's career milestone. He opened the first notebook to a random page. Elena's handwriting appeared halfway down a set of correction notes in red pen beside one of his sensor calibration calculations. Try 0.7 offset on trigger delay. Think the 0.5 is causing the lag on sharp curves. Below it, in parentheses, a smiley face. He closed the notebook, sat there with his hands flat on the table. From the hallway, he could hear the small sounds of Sadie, sleeping, the occasional shift, a half-exhaled breath, the specific quality of silence that only exists around a sleeping child once the house is quiet enough to hear it. He thought about the morning, the parking lot, Brielle Sutton's voice carrying across the cold air. He thought about the folder Graham had laid on his workbench. He thought about Elena's red pen smiley face. Then he pulled a blank sheet of paper from beside the toaster and wrote Naomi Pierce's name at the top. Underneath it, in a handwriting that was steadier than he felt, he began listing what he had. 3 days later, he got the meeting. It wasn't easy. Graham had gone back twice and been turned away. Naomi's assistant said she was in depositions, buried in a prior case, not available. On the third attempt, Graham apparently leaned across the desk and said something that Caleb would ask him about later, and Graham would only summarize, as I told her it was urgent, and that the nature of the urgency would be relevant to her professionally. Whatever the exact wording had been, it worked. The meeting was during Caleb's lunch break. He'd told no one. He didn't mention it to Graham again after it was arranged. He put the box in his truck. He kept Elena's old pickup for longer hauls and drove to the administrative building and parked in visitor parking and carried the box through the lobby like a man carrying something he intended to leave somewhere. Naomi Pierce's office was on the 4th floor, with windows that faced the parking lot. When Caleb was shown in, the first thing he noticed was that her desk was genuinely messy, not the theatrical mess of someone who wants to appear busy, but the lived-in disorder of a person who was actually managing too many things at once. He immediately felt slightly more comfortable. She stood to greet him. 40s. He guessed direct eyes, no small talk on her face. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Graham Holloway said this was urgent. "It is." He set the box on the chair beside him rather than on her desk, because he didn't want to assume. "Maintenance technician here. I've been with Redwood for 4 years. Before that, I was in the engineering division under Derek Vaughn, who Derek Vaughn is. Then you probably know about Project Meridian." Something in her expression adjusted, barely visible. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He didn't open the box yet. The adaptive torque distribution system, credited to Derek Vaughn and the Redwood internal team, he said. "I built the original prototype of that system. I developed the core algorithm, the sensor configuration, the activation threshold, the underlying architecture. All of it came from work I did with my wife between 2017 and 2019, before she died and I moved to maintenance." Naomi's pen was in her hand, but she wasn't writing anything. "That's a serious allegation," she said. "I know what it is, and what you have in that box: original notebooks with dated entries. Photographs of the prototype at multiple construction stages. Prototype itself is intact. It's currently installed in the motorcycle I ride to work. It has my initials stamped into the casing along with a build date." He paused. "I also have a written statement from Derek Vaughn promising attribution once the project was commercially ready. And I have a former colleague who can confirm independent familiarity with the early stage work." Mee looked at the box for a moment. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I'm going to ask you some technical questions about the adaptive torque distribution system. Very specific ones." "Ask them," she asked. He answered, not defensively, not with the tense over-precision of someone performing certainty. He answered the way a person answers questions about their own work, with the specific granularity that comes from having lived inside a problem. He explained the logic of the 3-point sensor layout and why the conventional 2-point approach produced unacceptable lag at high lean angles. He described the activation threshold calibration and how it had required 17 physical test runs on an empty industrial road at 2 in the morning before the dataset was clean. He explained why the algorithm prioritized rotational momentum input over speed data and what the flaw in the competing approach would be. He talked for about 12 minutes without stopping. When he finished, the room was quiet. Naomi looked down at her notepad. She hadn't written anything. "That algorithm description," she said slowly, "is more technically precise than anything in the internal development documentation I've reviewed." "That's because the internal documentation describes what the system does," Caleb said. "No, how it was arrived at." She looked up at him. "I need to see the box," she said. He slid it across the chair onto the edge of her desk. She opened it. He watched her flip through the first notebook. Stop, read, flip forward, stop again. She held the photograph of the prototype up near the window. She read Derek's handwritten letter very carefully, then set it down and picked it up and read it again. "This is Elena's handwriting?" she said, pointing to the red ink annotations. "Your wife, my late wife." She nodded slowly. She set the notebook down and looked at him across the desk. "If what you're showing me is what it appears to be," she said carefully, "then this isn't a documentation gap. This is deliberate removal of attribution. I know. That changes the nature of the patent filing significantly. I know that too. And you've kept all of this for 4 years without filing any claim. I had a 2-year-old daughter, and I was working 70% on grief alone," he said. "And Derek told me it would be handled. I believed him because I was dealing with everything else." He looked at the box. The years piled up and the patent was almost through, and at some point I decided I was done, deciding this wasn't my problem. Me didn't say anything for a moment. "I need to freeze the filing," she said, almost to herself. "That's your call to make." She looked at him directly. "You understand this is going to cause significant disruption at this company. A maintenance technician who invented the technology behind your company's most important product launch," he said. "I think the disruption was already here." She held his gaze. Then she reached for her desk phone. "Give me 72 hours, she said. He stood up, reached for the box. "Leave the box," she said. He left it. He walked out of the administrative building and across the parking lot past the visitor spots and stood for a moment beside Elena's pickup, one hand on the door handle, looking up at the cold sky. He wasn't sure what he felt. Not relieved exactly. Triumphant. Something closer to the sensation of setting down something heavy that you've been carrying for so long you'd forgotten what it felt like to have both hands free. He got in the truck. He still had 40 minutes of lunch break. He'd intervened. He drove to a diner 3 blocks from the school and ordered coffee and a grilled cheese and sat in a booth by the window and ate slowly, watching the street, thinking about nothing in particular. A bus went past. A woman walked a dog that was clearly walking her. The coffee was not good, but it was hot. His phone buzzed. A text from Sadie, sent from the school's shared tablet. "Can we have spaghetti tonight?" He texted back. "Yeah." "Set the table for me." "Okay." "You love you too." He set the phone down. Finished his coffee. Outside, the city moved around him in its ordinary and different way. And inside Caleb Mercer, something that had been very still for a very long time was beginning, slowly and without drama, to move. The 72 hours Naomi asked for stretched into 4 days, and Caleb counted every one of them. He didn't change anything about his routine. He came in at 7, ran his diagnostics, logged his maintenance tickets, ate lunch in the break room or at his workbench, depending on how the morning had gone. He nodded to people he knew and avoided people he didn't need to talk to. He picked Sadie up at 3:58. He made dinner. He helped with homework. He put her to bed. But underneath all of it, running like a secondary process he couldn't shut down, was the awareness of what was moving through Naomi Pierce's office 4 floors above him. He thought about the box sitting on her desk. He thought about Elena's red ink annotations. He thought about the hand-stamped prototype under old Betty's seat. And the 17 test runs on an empty road at 2 in the morning, and the photograph in his kitchen, and all the things that were his, had been quietly erased while he was busy surviving. Graham checked in on the second day, stopping by Caleb's station with the pretense of asking about a ventilation sensor that didn't actually need his input. "Anything?" Graham asked, keeping his voice low. "Nothing yet." "She's thorough," Graham said. "That's either a good sign or a very bad one, depending on what she finds." "She'll find what's there," Caleb said. "That's all I need." Graham nodded slowly. He picked up a wrench from Caleb's bench, examined it, set it back exactly where it had been. "Derek's been in a meeting every morning this week," he said. "Closed door. That's unusual for him." "How do you know that?" "'Cause his office is across from the conference room I walk past every morning on my way to the East Building, and that door has been shut every single day." Graham pushed his glass up. "I don't know if it means anything." "It might not," Caleb said. They left it there. On the 4th day, a Thursday, Caleb was replacing a faulty hydraulic seal on one of the press machines when his phone vibrated in his pocket. He finished the seal, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and checked the screen. A message from an internal extension he didn't recognize, Mr. Mercer. Please come to my office when you have a moment today. Pierce. He read it twice. He told his supervisor he needed an hour for a personal matter, which his supervisor approved without asking questions, because Caleb had not used a single sick day in 4 years and had accumulated enough goodwill in that department to ask for a small moon if he wanted one. He washed his hands properly this time, changed out of his work shirt into the plain gray button-down he kept in his locker for situations he couldn't anticipate, and walked to the administrative building. The lobby had the particular quiet of a space that had been designed to impress rather than to be lived in. Marble flooring that was always cold, large corporate photography on the walls, a reception desk that nobody was ever quite sure how to approach. He took the elevator to the 4th floor. Naomi's office door was half open. She was at her desk, phone wedged between her ear and shoulder, writing something with her free hand. When she saw him in the doorway, she pointed at the chair across from her desk and held up one finger. He sat. He looked at the box on the side table. He hadn't expected it to still be there, had half expected it to have been moved or locked away somewhere, but it was sitting exactly where he'd left it, with what looked like a sticky note attached to the cover in Naomi's handwriting. She finished her call, set the phone down, did not immediately speak. "The filing is frozen," she said. He let the words land before he said anything back. "Okay," he said. "I want to be precise about what I mean when I say frozen. I told the board I identified a procedural irregularity in the documentation that required review before we could proceed. I did not at this stage specify what the irregularity was or who was involved. That will come." She folded her hands on the desk. "Before it does, I want to tell you what I found. All right, your development notebooks show a clear, dated, internally consistent record of the adaptive torque distribution system from concept to functional prototype. The handwriting, the technical language, the progression of the work, all of it is coherent with someone who genuinely developed the system from the ground up. The photographs match the prototype you described. Prototype itself, which I arranged to have independently examined yesterday." "You examined old Betty?" he said. "The motorcycle was inspected at your request, per the maintenance agreement you signed when you first began employment. The prototype component was identified, photographed, and independently dated. Her voice didn't change register. The hand stamps on the casing confirm your initials and a build date that predates Redwood's internal development records for the adaptive torque distribution system by 14 months. 14 months. He'd known it, but hearing someone else say it with that particular flatness made it concrete in a different way. Written promise from Derek Vaughn," she continued, "is on company letterhead, signed and dated. It is explicit enough to constitute an acknowledgement that you had a proprietary stake in the development work. Whether it would survive a full contract challenge is a separate question, but it is not nothing." She paused. "And then there is the other thing." "What other thing?" She opened a folder on her desk and turned it so he could read it. He leaned forward. It was an internal records log, development documentation from the original engineering period, showing edit histories for project files. His name appeared 3 times in the early versions, each time listed under primary development credits. Versions dated 2 months after his transfer to maintenance. His name was gone, moved, not reorganized. Gone, replaced in one instance by a placeholder that had later been overwritten with Derek's name. "Someone edited those records," Caleb said. "The IP system logs metadata on every edit, including who was logged in when the change was made." She tapped the folder. It was not a system error. It was not a reorganization. Seedland, someone with administrative credentials went into the original development files and removed your name from the attribution records. "The room was very quiet, Derek," Caleb said. "The credentials belonged to him, yes." Her voice was careful. "I want to be clear that I'm not making a legal determination at this moment. I'm telling you what the documentation shows. I understand the difference." She sat back. "I've been practicing IP law for 17 years, she said, and it was the first thing she'd said that wasn't purely informational. "I've seen attribution disputes. I've seen documentation gaps. I've seen cases where the story was complicated and the truth was somewhere in the middle. What I'm looking at here is not complicated. Your name was removed. It was removed deliberately, and the evidence that it should be there is sitting in that box. Caleb looked at the box. He thought about saying something and decided there was nothing adequate. "What happens now?" he said. "That depends partly on you and partly on how this moves through the executive level," Naomi said. "I have a legal obligation to report what I've found to Brielle Sutton. She is the CEO and the company's primary decision-maker on matters of this magnitude. That conversation will happen, and when it does, Derek Vaughn will almost certainly be made aware that there is an active internal review." She looked at him steadily. "He will respond to that. I want you to be prepared for the possibility that he will try to apply pressure before this is resolved." "What kind of pressure?" "The kind that questions your motives. The kind that suggests you're confused about the nature of your contributions. The kind that points to your current position as evidence that you weren't considered essential." She didn't blink. "The kind that involves your daughter." The air in the room changed. "He wouldn't," Caleb said, and even as he said it, he knew that was a naive thing to say about a man who'd spent 4 years quietly erasing another person's name. "People in defensive positions do things they wouldn't otherwise do," Naomi said. "I'm not predicting what he'll do. I'm telling you to be prepared." He sat with that. "Can you protect the box?" he said. "The physical materials. They're already in a secure evidence file. The original notebook pages have been scanned and copies stored on an encrypted server." She paused. "The box goes nowhere without your written consent." "Kay," he stood. "I appreciate you telling me directly. It's my job," she said, then seemed to reconsider. "It's also the right thing to do, which isn't always the same as my job. But in this case, it happens to be both." He nodded. He walked out. He was halfway back to the maintenance bay when he heard Derek Vaughn's voice behind him. "Caleb." He stopped, turned around slowly. Derek was coming down the hallway from the direction of the executive elevator, not from his own office, which was in a different wing. He'd been upstairs. The timing was either coincidence or it wasn't, and Caleb had stopped believing in convenient coincidences about 4 days ago. Derek Vaughn was 55, thick through the chest, with the particular confidence of a man who had spent decades being the smartest person in rooms that didn't have enough smart people. He had a handshake he used as a power move, and a habit of leaning in slightly when he talked to you, which some people mistook for warmth and which Caleb had eventually understood was a kind of territorial gesture. "Got a minute?" Derek said. His voice was easy. That was the thing about Derek, his voice was almost always easy. "I've got to get back to my station," Caleb said. "It'll only take a minute." He gestured toward a small conference room off the hallway, door open, empty. The kind of room nobody ever specifically booked for meetings, because it was too small and too close to the copy machines, which meant it was always available and always private. Caleb went in. He didn't sit. Derek closed the door and didn't sit either. "I heard there's a documentation review happening on Project Meridian," Derek said. "Someone flagged a procedural issue." "That's not something I'd know about," Caleb said. "I'm in maintenance." "Right." Derek smiled, and it didn't reach anything behind his eyes. "Listen, I know things have been hard for you, Sue. They've been hard since Elena. Everyone knows that, and everyone respects the way you've kept things together for your daughter. You're a good father, Caleb. That's never been in question. I appreciate that. But I want to be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty." He put his hands in his pockets. Relaxed posture, practiced. "If someone has approached you with questions about the early development work on, I want you to know that I understand how memory works. After trauma, after loss, things get blurry. The timeline shifts. You might genuinely believe that your early contributions were more central than the records reflect. That's a human thing. That's not a moral failing." Caleb looked at him. "I'm not confused about the timeline," he said. "Nobody's saying confused. You told me my contributions would be formally documented," Caleb said. "You wrote that down on company letterhead, dated." Something in Derek's easy expression tightened, almost imperceptibly, like a cloth with too much tension in it. "Context matters on things like that," Derek said. That was a general acknowledgement of your early-stage participation. It was never an attribution commitment. There's a meaningful legal difference there. Is that what your lawyers are telling you?" "Caleb." He stepped forward slightly. "That territorial lean. I want to help you here. I genuinely do. You've got a good situation, steady job, reasonable hours. You're home for your daughter every day. That's not nothing. A lot of people can't say that. You've built something real. He let a beat pass. I would hate to see you disrupt all of that by pushing on something that isn't going to give you what you think it will. The room was small enough that Caleb could hear the copy machine in the hallway starting a job. Are you threatening my job? Caleb said. I'm protecting your stability, Derek said, because I know how much it matters to you. To Sadie. He said her name, the way people say a name when they want you to feel its weight. Caleb felt something move through him, not heat exactly. More like the moment before heat, the intake of breath before the burn. He kept his face still, because he'd learned how to keep his face still. In the years after Elena, in Maine tis seat, when keeping his face still and the school parking lot and the pediatrician's office was the only way to get through situations without his daughter witnessing him fall apart. I appreciate your concern, Caleb said. His voice was level, and he was proud of that. I'll see you around, Derek. He opened the conference room door and walked out. He did not look back. He walked down the hallway and around the corner and kept walking until he was through the door to the stairwell where no one was, and he stood there with his hand against the cold cinder block wall and breathed. 3 breaths. 4. He pushed off the wall and went back to work. He got back to his station and picked up the next maintenance ticket and started on the job without pausing, because the only way to get through the rest of the afternoon was to have his hands doing something. He replaced a cracked coolant line on a floor press. He ran diagnostics on 2 conveyor sensors that had been throwing intermittent alerts. He cleaned and recalibrated a brake actuator on a test rig that had been slightly off for a week. At 3:45, he logged out, got his bag, went to the parking lot. He stood beside old Betty for a moment. He crouched down and ran his hand along the underside of the seat, feeling the edge of the prototype casing beneath the upholstery. The metal was cool and slightly rough, the hand stamps along the edge small but precise, each letter and digit pressed into the steel with a punch set he'd bought at a hardware store on a Tuesday in January, because he'd wanted the documentation to be physical, real, undeniable. He pressed his thumb against the initials, CM 1.14.18. January 14th, 2018. The night the system first ran clean. Elena had been there. She'd written "there it is" in her notebook in red ink and put a smiley face next to it, and then looked up at him across the garage and said, "We should probably sleep before you drive this thing anywhere." And he'd agreed, and they'd gone inside, and Sadie had been asleep, and the world had been very quiet and very good. He stood up. He got on the motorcycle and rode to pick up his daughter. Sadie was in a complicated mood when she came out of school, the kind that settled over her, sometimes for a single articulable reason, where she was quiet in a way that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite tiredness, but was something she'd inherited from him that he didn't have a name for. She climbed into the sidecar and buckled her own harness and didn't say much on the ride home. Inside, he started water for pasta. She sat at the kitchen table and did her reading homework, which she was better at than fractions, and therefore less aggravated by. The apartment filled with the small sounds of an ordinary evening water heating, page turning, old Betty cooling in the lot outside, with the faint tick of contracting metal. "Dad," Sadie said without looking up from her book, "is something at work making you worried?" He turned from the stove. She was still looking at her book. "What makes you ask that?" "You've been thinking hard about something for a few days," she said. "I can tell, because you stir things that don't need stirring." He looked at the spoon in his hand, moving in slow circles through water that had nothing in it yet. "You're very observant," he said. "Ms. Dillon says that too." She turned a page. "You don't have to tell me if it's complicated." "It is complicated," he said. "It's going to be okay." "How do you know?" He set the spoon down. "Because I'm not doing anything wrong," he said. "I'm just asking for something that should have been mine a long time ago." She finally looked up. Her expression was the one she had when she was processing. Something too big for 7, but trying anyway. "Is it about the motorcycle?" she said. He stared at her. "Why would you ask that?" She shrugged. "'Cause you looked at it for a long time today, before you came to get me. I saw you through the fence." He didn't say anything for a moment. He said finally, "It's sort of about the motorcycle." She seemed to find that satisfying. She went back to her book. He put the pasta in. They ate at the table the way they always did, the two of them on opposite sides, Sadie's rabbit in its usual chair. She told him about the book she was reading for her class, which involved a dog who could read maps, and suggested the plot with a thoroughness that suggested she'd been rehearsing it since lunch. He listened. He asked questions. He ate his pasta. After dinner, he washed the dishes and she dried, which was their arrangement. She stood on the step stool he'd built for her. No, out of a short section of 2x4s when she was 5, because she'd asked to help, and the counter was too high. The step stool was starting to seem slightly unnecessary now. She was getting tall. He wasn't sure when that had happened. He got her to bed by 8:30, which was a reasonable outcome for a Thursday. He read 2 chapters of the map-reading dog book because she'd asked him to catch up with her. The dog's name was Biscuit, and the dog was competent and reassuring, and Caleb understood why 7-year-olds found that comforting. He kissed her forehead. He turned the light out. He went to the kitchen. He made himself a cup of tea he didn't particularly want, and sat at the table and pulled out a legal pad and a pen. For anything specific, he'd given Naomi everything she needed. The box was in a secure file. The process was moving, whether he pushed it or not. He just needed to do something with his hands that wasn't stirring water. He wrote Derek's name at the top and then immediately crossed it out, which felt petty but also accurate. He thought about what Naomi had said. He will try to apply pressure. He'd already done it. It had been subtle and wrapped in apparent concern, but it had been entirely clear. And the clearest part of it, the part that had taken the most effort to absorb without reaction, was the invocation of Sadie's name. The use of his daughter as a pressure point, as a variable to be manipulated. He sat with that for a while. He thought about what it had cost him to stay quiet for 4 years. Not in the financial sense. The financial math was something he was only beginning to calculate. The other cost. The thing it had done to his sense of himself to wake up every morning and go to a job in a company that was building its future on work, that had his wife's handwriting in the margins, and smile at people in hallways and say nothing. He told himself he was choosing Sadie, and that was true. He had been choosing Sadie every day without regret. But he'd also, without fully acknowledging it, been choosing the path that required the least fight because he hadn't had anything left to fight with. Grief had taken the reserves, and then the years had passed, and the grief had slowly, imperfectly, become something he could carry without it taking up all the room, and he'd looked up one day and realized the quiet he'd chosen had become a trap. He wasn't angry at himself for that. He understood it. He just didn't want to be in it anymore. He put the legal pad away, rinsed his mug, turned off the kitchen light. In the living room, he stopped at the window and looked out at the parking lot. Old Betty was down there, under the sodium light, paint dull and chrome oxidized, and the sidecar attached at a slight angle that was structurally fine but cosmetically imperfect. She looked, as Sadie had said, like she'd had a hard life. Caleb had always thought she looked exactly like what she was, something that had been through something real and kept running anyway. He watched the light on her for a moment, then went to bed. 2 days later, Naomi called him on his cell at 7 in the morning. "I've met with Brielle Sutton," she said. "She's requested a full executive review. It's been scheduled for Monday." Caleb was standing in the kitchen, coffee untouched. Sadie still asleep. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means this goes to the highest level of decision-making at this company," Naomi said. "Brielle will review the complete evidence package. Derek will be present and will have the opportunity to present his account. I will present the documentation findings." A pause. "You won't be in the room." That landed differently than he expected. "I'm not in the room. Not for this meeting. This is an internal executive proceeding. If it goes to any kind of formal legal process, that changes. But for this meeting, no." Her voice was level. "I want to be honest with you, because I think you've been misled enough. The room will be hostile to the evidence in the sense that there are people in it whose interests are aligned with not finding it credible. I will present it anyway. I've found what I found, and I stand behind it. But I want you to know that the first room this goes into is not necessarily going to produce the outcome you deserve." He looked at the photograph of Elena on the counter. "I understand," he said. "The documentation speaks for itself," Naomi said. "That's what I want you to hold on to." "Okay. Monday," she said. "I'll contact you when it's over." She hung up. He set the phone down. He poured his coffee. It had gone slightly past the right temperature, but he drank it anyway. From Sadie's room came the small, specific sounds of her waking the shift of blankets, one slow exhale, the thump of her feet finding the floor. "Dad," she called. "Kitchen." He called back. Footsteps in the hallway. She appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, hair impossibly tangled, one sock on and one somewhere in the blankets probably. "Is it Saturday?" she said. "Saturday," he confirmed. She processed this with evident satisfaction. "Can we make pancakes?" he said. "She'd go find your other sock first." She disappeared back down the hallway, already thinking to herself about something, or possibly to the rabbit. He said it's intervened. He set his mug down and pulled the flour from the cabinet and the eggs from the refrigerator and this mixing bowl from the lower cabinet that always stuck slightly before it opened. He mixed the batter by hand, the way Elena used to do it, because she'd had strong opinions about overmixing, and the way it made pancakes tough rather than tender, and those opinions had become his opinions without him ever making a conscious decision about it. He got the pan going on medium heat. He buttered it. Sadie reappeared with the sock on and her rabbit tucked under her arm. She climbed onto her stool. "Can I pour?" she said. "You can pour." He handed her the ladle and she poured with the focused intensity of a surgeon, her tongue pressed to her lower lip, brow furrowed. The first one landed slightly lopsided. "It's a weird shape," she observed. "It'll taste the same, but it looks like a boot." "Boots are good," she ladled the second one. "Better." She looked satisfied. He stood beside her at the stove on a Saturday morning in the apartment with the dripping faucet and the coffee table pushed against the wall and the drawings on every surface, his daughter's sock pressing against his leg as she leaned to check the edges of the pancakes for bubbles, and he thought, whatever happens Monday, this is what I'm fighting for. The credit alone. Not even the money. This. The thing that costs you everything to protect and that you'd spend everything again, without hesitation, to keep intact. The pancake edges started to bubble now, Sadie said. He said. She flipped it. It landed cleanly. She looked up at him with an expression of complete triumph. "Perfect," she said. He looked at the pancake, which was actually slightly oval and a little dark on one side. "Pretty close," he said. She considered it. Close enough, she decided. And the morning moved forward the way mornings do, ordinary and irreplaceable, full of small sounds and maple syrup, and a child who trusted that the person beside her had things handled, and a father who was going to make very sure that was true. Monday came the way difficult days always do, unremarkably, without warning in the weather or any particular signal in the morning light that something was about to shift. The sky was the same flat gray it had been for a week. The parking lot had the same frost in the same backward L crack in the asphalt. Old Betty's engine knocked once and caught on the second pull. Caleb rode to work. He parked. He walked in. He was not in the room where it was happening. It was the part he kept having to remind himself to accept. Somewhere above him on the executive floor, in a conference room he'd never been inside. Mee Pierce was opening a folder and laying out what she'd found while Derek Vaughn sat across from Brielle Sutton and constructed whatever version of events he'd been building all weekend. And Caleb was in the maintenance bay replacing a worn drive belt on a conveyor system, because that was his job. No. And the only way to get through the morning was to have his hands doing something real. Graham came by at 9:15. He didn't say anything. He just stood near the workbench for a moment, picked up a bolt, set it down, and left. It was Graham's version of emotional support, and Caleb genuinely appreciated it. At 10:40, his phone buzzed, unknown internal extension. He answered it. "Mr. Mercer." It was Naomi's assistant, a young woman named Petra, whose voice Caleb had learned to read over the past week. Right now it was careful. "Miss Pierce would like you to come to the executive floor. Conference room B as soon as possible." He set his tools down. "Conference room B," he said. "Not her office." "That's correct." "Who's in the room?" A half-second pause. "Ms. Pierce will brief you when you arrive." He thanked her and hung up. He washed his hands. He changed his shirt. He walked to the elevator. The fourth floor had a different quality of silence than the floors below it, carpet instead of industrial tile, the sound absorption of a space designed for conversations that weren't meant to carry. The air smelled like coffee, and the faint chemical note of dry, cleaned wool. Caleb walked down the hall and met him near the elevator, and walked with him, without speaking, toward a door that was slightly ajar, warm light coming through the gap. She stopped before they reached it. Miss Pierce had told you the meeting concluded about 20 minutes ago, Petra said quietly. She asked for you to be brought up directly afterward. She looked at him with the expression of someone who wanted to say more and had decided not to. I'll let her know you're here. She went in, came back out, held the door. Caleb went in. The conference room was larger than he'd expected. A long table, 8 chairs, windows along one wall, showing the parking lot below. Mie was at the far end of the table. Her folder was open in front of her, and her jacket was on the back of her chair in a way that suggested the meeting had run long enough for her to get uncomfortable. Across the table and slightly apart, seated against the windows, was Brielle Sutton. Caleb registered her the way you register a person when you've only ever seen them at a distance, the slight adjustment between the impression and the reality. She was smaller than she seemed in the parking lot. Dressed in a dark blazer, no coat, her dark hair pulled back with 2 or 3 strands that had worked loose at some point in the last few hours and hadn't been tucked back. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her. She was looking at him. Derek was not in the room. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down across from Naomi, at Naomi's end of the table, which put Brielle at the far edge of his peripheral vision. He looked at Naomi first. "The meeting's over?" he said. "It concluded at 10:15, Naomi said. Her voice was contained in the particular way it got when she was managing multiple things simultaneously and needed her tone to do some of the work for her. "I wanted you here for a brief follow-up conversation before anything else moves forward. See, something to summarize what was presented, and then I'd like you to hear directly from Ms. Sutton." Naomi looked at her notes, though Caleb had the impression she didn't need them. "I've presented the full evidence package, the notebooks, the photographs, the prototype documentation, the metadata logs showing the attribution edits, and Derek Vaughn's written promise regarding formal credit. I walked through the technical findings, the development timeline, and the discrepancy between the original records and the current filing documentation. And Derek? Mr. Vaughn argued that your early stage work was foundational but preliminary, and that the commercializable system was the result of subsequent development work performed under his direction by the broader engineering team. He argued that the prototype under your motorcycle represented proof of concept only, and that proof of concept is equivalent to the developed system. She said it cleanly, without inflection, which was more chilling than if she'd editorialized. He also suggested that your transfer to maintenance indicated you had voluntarily disengaged from the project, and that the written promise was a personal gesture of goodwill rather than a legal commitment. Caleb looked at the table for a moment. What did the metadata say about that argument? The metadata shows that your name was removed from the development records 8 weeks after your transfer, Naomi said. If you had voluntarily disengaged, there would have been no need to remove you. Voluntary disengagement is its own documentation. What happened instead was a deliberate erasure. She closed the folder. I made that point in the room. How did it land? She glanced very briefly toward Brielle. Caleb turned to look at her directly for the first time. Brielle was already looking at him. She had been, he realized, for most of the time he'd been in the room, with an expression that was difficult to read, not hostile, not apologetic exactly, something more unsettled than either of those. Yes, he didn't. The expression of someone who had walked into a meeting expecting one thing and come out carrying something heavier. Sutton, he said. He didn't know what else to say, so he just left her name there. She straightened slightly. I want to start by saying that I've reviewed the evidence personally, she said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that wasn't quite controlled, like a current below a calm surface. All of it. The notebooks, the timestamps, the edit logs. She paused. I also asked our lead systems engineer to review the technical documentation last night independently, without context about what he was comparing it against. His assessment was that the development methodology in your notebooks is consistent with the architecture of the adaptive torque distribution system at a level of specificity that goes well beyond general contribution. He confirmed it was mine, Caleb said. He said the evidence strongly supports it. Yes. She held his gaze. I'm not going to tell you I handled this perfectly. I didn't know this was happening. That's an excuse. I should have had processes in place that would have caught this. I didn't. She looked like the admission cost her something. What happened to your work was wrong. What happened to your name in those records was deliberate, and it was wrong. And I want to understand what you want to happen now. The room was quiet. Caleb looked at the windows. The parking lot was visible below he could smell. Malt and dull painted against the asphalt, the sidecar attached at its characteristic slight angle. He looked at it for a moment and then looked back. I want my name on it, he said, as the original inventor, as a contributor, not as part of a team credit. The original inventor, because that's what I am. Brielle nodded slowly. A royalty agreement, he said. A fair one. Amy can define what fair looks like legally, but I want something that's structured as ongoing participation in what the technology earns, not a one-time settlement payment that makes it easy to forget the rest. That's reasonable, Brielle said. There's one more thing. She waited. My wife's name was Elena Mercer, Caleb said. She died 4 years ago. She sat in a cold garage with me for 2 years, checking my math and running tests, and writing correction notes in red pen at 1 in the morning because she believed the system could work. She never saw it finished. He stopped for a second, got the sentence back. I want a fund, something financed by a percentage of the technology's profits. Road safety research for motorcycles. Young engineers' early-stage development support. I want it named after her. The Elena Mercer Road Safety Fund. Brielle looked at him for a long moment. You didn't ask for your engineering position back, she said. You're not asking for damages. You're not asking for an executive role. You're asking for attribution, a royalty, and a fund named after your wife. She seemed to be processing something. Why not the position? You're clearly capable of. Because I pick my daughter up at 4 o'clock, he said. Picked her up at 4 o'clock every day for 4 years. She lost her mother. She's not losing her father to 70-hour weeks and product launches and whatever the engineering division looks like when you're trying to prove something. He said it without apology. The job I have lets me be where I need to be. I'd like to keep it. Something shifted in Brielle's face. Not a dramatic shift. She wasn't a person who let things move dramatically across her face. He was beginning to understand that, but a real one. Like something she'd been expecting to find in one direction, turned out to be somewhere else entirely. Okay, she said quietly. One other thing, Caleb said. Brielle's jaw tightened slightly. Yes. He threatened me, Caleb said. He said it plainly, because there was no other way to say it. Explicitly. But he came to me before the meeting and made it clear that pursuing this could affect my stability here. He used my daughter's name. He let that sit. I'm not asking you to prosecute him. I'm asking you to make sure he doesn't have authority over anyone's work again. Mine, not anyone else's. Brielle looked at Naomi. Naomi's expression was unreadable, which probably meant she'd already addressed this, or was about to. Derek Vaughn's position is under review, as of this morning, Brielle said. That review began before this conversation. It will conclude appropriately. She said it in the flat, decisive way of someone closing a door. It's not something I need you to worry about. Caleb nodded. He put his hands on the table and pushed his chair back. I'd like Naomi to handle the formal documentation, he said. The attribution corrections, the royalty structure, the fund framework. I trust her to do it right. He looked at Naomi. If that's okay with you. It's my job, Naomi said, with the faint echo of what she'd told him in her office a week ago. This time she said it like something she meant more broadly. Caleb stood up. He was almost at the door when Brielle spoke. Mr. Mercer. He turned around. She was still at the table, hands flat, posture straight. But something in her face had the quality of a person about to say something they hadn't planned on saying. The morning in the parking lot, she said. With the motorcycle. He waited. I said something that I was careless. She didn't look away. I was tired, and I was under pressure, and I took it out on something that didn't deserve it. And you were standing right there. She paused. I didn't know who you were. He said, I'm sorry. He looked at her, not with coldness, and not with the kind of magnanimous warmth that the moment might have called for in a different kind of story. He looked at her the way he looked at most things directly, without performance, he said again, and meant it differently this time. He went back to work. He was at his station for exactly 11 minutes before Graham appeared. Graham had clearly been positioned somewhere nearby waiting for him to return, which was the most emotionally expressive thing. Caleb had ever seen him do. Graham said. She heard it, Caleb said. She's moving on it. Graham was quiet for a moment. Derek? His position is under review. Graham exhaled through his nose in a way that wasn't quite a sigh and wasn't quite a laugh. He picked up a wrench from the bench, examined it, set it back down. Elena would have said something extremely pointed about all of this, he said. Caleb looked at him. Graham almost never mentioned Elena. In 4 years, Caleb could count the times on one hand. She would have, Caleb agreed. Probably unprintable. Graham made the not-quite-sigh sound again. Good, he said, and went back to the east building. Caleb stood at his workbench for a moment, doing nothing. He looked at the photograph of Sadie taped at eye level on the cabinet. She was wearing the purple jacket, and her head was tilted back, laughing at something off-frame. No. And her rabbit was tucked under her arm with a kind of reflexive certainty, the way children hold things they love without thinking about it. He reached for his next maintenance ticket and got back to work. The formal documentation process took 3 weeks, which was faster than Naomi had initially suggested, and slower than Caleb would have liked. He understood that both were true simultaneously. He signed things. He provided additional records when Naomi asked for them. He attended 2 short meetings in Naomi's office that were procedural rather than in the prototype, and the notebooks and the timestamp records. There was not much left to contest. The documentation spoke for itself, as Naomi had said it would. Derek Vaughn's employment with Redwood Dynamics ended at the end of the 3rd week. Announcement. He was simply there, and then he wasn't. The way people sometimes disappear from institutional environments when the alternative is too loud for everyone involved. Someone put a plant in his office. Caleb passed the open door twice and looked at the plant both times and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite nothing. The patent documentation was formally amended. His name appeared now on the first page, under the heading for original concept and prototype development, with a secondary notation referencing the collaborative contribution of Elena Mercer to the early stage theoretical work. Naomi had included Elena's name without being asked, based on what the notebook showed. When she told him he'd been at his workbench, he'd nodded and said thank you, and then not spoken for about 30 seconds while he got his breathing sorted out. You okay? Naomi had asked. Yeah, he said. Her handwriting's in the margins of everything. Had said, I know, I've read them all. And then she'd gone back to her office, which was the right thing to do. The royalty agreement was structured as a percentage of net revenue generated by the adaptive torque distribution system across all products it was incorporated into, paid quarterly, with an adjustment clause tied to licensing agreements if the technology went external. Caleb read every paragraph with the focus of a man who understood language could be used to say one thing while meaning another. He asked Naomi 3 specific questions about the enforcement clauses. She answered them. He signed. The Elena Mercer Road Safety Fund was incorporated as an independent nonprofit, with Redwood listed as its primary founding donor and Caleb as a board member. The first operational meeting was scheduled for the following spring, when the initial grant cycle would open for applications. The fund's stated purpose was to support early-stage research in motorcycle safety systems with priority given to individual engineers and small development teams for the specific configuration that had been Caleb and Elena in a cold garage with a folding table and a borrowed oscilloscope and all the time in the world. He told Sadie about the fund on a Wednesday night, after homework and dinner, while she was drawing at the kitchen table. He'd been thinking about how to say it for days and had not arrived at a clean version, so he just said it. How I told you some of what happened at work was about Mom's work too? She looked up. Her marker was still in her hand. The math she helped with, she said. She'd absorbed the simplified version he'd given her the previous week, which had been something along the lines of, a long time ago, Mom and I built something important together, and the company I work for is going to say so officially now. Right, he said. Part of what Redwood is going to do is create a fund. Yes, he'd intervened. They're going to take some of the money the invention earns and use it to help other engineers who are working on motorcycle safety systems. People who are trying to build things that keep riders safe. She was watching him carefully. And they're going to name it after Mom, he said. Sadie was quiet for a moment. She looked down at her drawing, which was apparently a horse wearing sneakers, then back up at him. So other people will know her name, she said. Yeah. Other engineers, researchers, people who care about the same things she cared about. Sadie thought about this in the thorough, slightly sideways way. She thought about important things. That's good, she said finally. Not with performance, not with the emotional flourish an adult might have applied to the moment. That's good, settled and certain. I think so too, Caleb said. She went back to the horse's sneakers. He sat at the table across from her and did not try to extend the moment, because the moment had been exactly what it needed to be, which was small and true and enough. It was around this time, in the quiet period between the paperwork and the formal launch announcement, that Brigel Sutton began appearing in his vicinity more than was strictly explainable by logistics. The first time he noticed, it was a Tuesday, when he was eating lunch at his bench, sandwich coffee in the Thermsons, the sports section of a newspaper he'd grabbed, mostly for the crossword, and she came into the maintenance bay with the head of facilities to review a structural assessment on the East Building's ventilation system. The maintenance bay was not a natural stop on an executive tour. Facilities reviews happened, but Brielle did not typically attend them in person. She was there for about 20 minutes, asked specific and apparently genuine questions about the ventilation load calculations, and on the way out paused at the edge of Caleb's station. "How are you doing?" she said. "Fine," he said, because it was the honest answer, and also because he wasn't sure what else she was asking. "The documentation processing is moving," she said. He says, "You've been responsive." "I've had 4 years to organize the materials," he said. "Shouldn't take long." She looked at him for a moment. "Do you eat lunch here every day?" "Usually. That seems like it could get monotonous." "I like my bench," he said. Something that was almost a smile crossed her face before she moved on. A social smile, something more reflexive than that, like a reaction she hadn't decided to have. The second time was a Friday, when she was walked through the main floor, with a vendor group, and the route happened to take her within view of his station. And their eyes met briefly across the floor, and she gave a short nod that he returned, and that was the entirety of it. But the vendor route normally went through the East Corridor, which he knew because the vendor groups always went through the East Corridor, because it was cleaner and better lit, and the West floor, where his station was, had the industrial smell that didn't read well on first impressions. She'd gone through the West floor. He didn't think too hard about it. He had other things to think about. The third time was different. It was a Thursday afternoon, a week before the formal company announcement about the patent correction. He was doing end-of-day cleanup at his bench, log entries, tools back in their positions, the particular small ritual of the last 15 minutes of his workday that he treated with more precision than probably made sense. He heard footsteps and looked up expecting Graham or one of the other techs. It was Brielle. She was alone, which was unusual. She was in the same kind of put-together clothes she always wore, but her jacket was over her arm instead of on, and her hair had the end-of-day looseness of someone who'd stopped maintaining the morning version of themselves, around 3 p. She looked very slightly, like a person, rather than a position. "I'm not interrupting anything critical," she said, which was technically a question. "I'm logging out," he said. "I'll be fast." She stopped a comfortable distance away from the bench, which he noted because most people who wanted something stood closer than that. "I've been thinking about what you said in the meeting, about your daughter." He waited. "I've been thinking about it more than I expected to," she said. "The part about the 4 o'clock pickup. And the part about she's already lost her mother. She's not losing her father." She stopped, recalibrating something in herself. "I run a company that demands a lot from the people who work here. I always told myself that was the job, that everyone understood it and chose it. Some people choose it," he said carefully. "Right." She looked at the photograph of Sadie on his cabinet. He watched her look at it. "Is that her?" "Yeah." "How old?" 7. "She looks like a talker." "She's an extraordinary talker," he said. Brielle looked at the photograph for another moment. "I don't ask people about their children," she said. "I never know if it's welcome or if it seems like I'm collecting information. But I've been thinking about what kind of father waits 4 years without making noise, and the answer keeps being someone who was using every available unit of themselves to keep a child's world stable." She looked at him. Someone who forgot what he was owed. Someone who was carrying too much to fight. He didn't say anything. That's what I should have understood earlier, she said, and I didn't. And that's on me as much as any of this is on anyone. You didn't know, he said. No, but I should have had systems that meant I would know. She shifted her jacket from one arm to the other. I wanted to say that directly. Not in a room with lawyers. He looked at her, actually looked. The way he looked at a machine he was trying to understand. With the specific attention that didn't try to impose an interpretation. He said. She seemed slightly caught by the directness of the question. Why did I want to say it directly? Why does it matter to you, he said. Specifically to you. You corrected the documentation. You set up the fund. You did what needed doing. You didn't have to come down here to explain yourself. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere on the floor, a machine cycled through its closing sequence with the familiar low mechanical shudder. The sound faded. Because I stood in that parking lot, she said, and I made fun of something without knowing what it was. And what it turned out to be was... She stopped. It was years of someone's life. It was a marriage. It was grief. It was a child growing up without her mother. It was still carrying someone to work every day without complaint. She looked at his face. Deserves more than paperwork. He held her gaze for a moment. Old Betty's not that fragile, he said. Something broke open in her expression, not dramatically. Just a real laugh, short and unguarded, the kind that happens when something catches you off guard in the best possible way. She pressed her fingers briefly against her mouth like she was surprised at herself. Old Betty, she said. That's what Sadie calls her. Sadie named your motorcycle. Sadie names everything, he said. The step stool in the kitchen is Gerald. The dish rack is Margaret. I don't know how Margaret got her name, but we're all committed to it now. Brielle was still smiling, and it was the least managed expression he'd seen on her, and he noticed that she looked substantially more like herself in it than she did in any of the official contexts he'd encountered her in. I should let you get to 4 o'clock, she said. He checked his watch. 3:48. He'd been slightly distracted, which was unusual. He said. She started toward the exit, then paused. The announcement goes out next week, she said. The patent correction, the attribution update. It'll go company-wide and then external. I wanted you to know it's not going to be buried in the footnotes. I appreciate that. Your name will be the first line, she said. Was my specific instruction. She left. He stood at his bench in the quiet that followed and looked at the photograph of Sadie and thought about nothing in particular for about 45 seconds, which was approximately 45 seconds longer than he usually spent not thinking about anything. He packed his bag and walked to the parking lot. Old Betty was under the sodium light, the same as always, paint oxidized, chrome dull, sidecar at its characteristic slight angle, the hand-stamped prototype beneath the seat where it had always been, patient and irrefutable. He stood beside her for a moment, with his hand on the frame. He thought about Elena and January and the cold garage and the baby monitor and the data coming back clean for the first time and Elena's voice saying, there it is. That's it. He thought about all the versions of the Merville, about all the versions of himself that had stood in various parking lots across 4 years, carrying the box under the bed, driving past the administrative building, telling himself it wasn't the right time. He thought about Brielle Sutton, standing in the maintenance bay with her jacket over her arm, saying that deserves more than paperwork. He put on his helmet. He rode and parked at the edge of the lot and waited by the front entrance, which was where he always waited, and she came out at 3:57, 1 minute early, which was unusual running again the way she always ran, when she saw him, full speed, backpack bouncing, completely without self-consciousness. He caught her. She was definitely heavier. How were fractions today, he said. We didn't do fractions, she said into his shoulder. Did shapes. How were shapes? She pulled back. Shapes are friendly, she said, with the authority of someone announcing a discovery. Fractions are not shapes. I think that's the problem. That's a theory, he said. She was already looking at old Betty with her usual appraising expression. Dad, she said, yeah, I've been thinking. She tugged her helmet out from under the seat. If Margaret the dish rack has a name, old Betty should have a real name too. Like a full name. Old Betty is a full name. It's a nickname, she said. I think her full name is Elizabeth. He looked at the motorcycle. Elizabeth, he said. Elizabeth Mercer, Sadie said with finality. Because she's part of the family. He buckled her harness. He got on the bike. He started the engine, which knocked once, and caught on the second pull, the same as always. "All right," he said. "Elizabeth Mercer it is." Sadie patted the sidecar approvingly. "She seems happy about it," she said. "She does," he agreed. He pulled out of the school lot into the street, and the engine settled into its low, familiar rumble. And his daughter sat beside him, with her rabbit on her lap, and her face turned slightly into the wind, the way she'd done since she was 3 years old, and the city moved around them in its ordinary late afternoon way. Caleb Mercer drove home through it all without hurry, carrying everything that mattered, as he always did, right beside. The company announcement went out on a Tuesday morning, 7:42, before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. Caleb knew because Naomi had told him the timing, and he'd been at his bench since 7:15, which was earlier than usual, but he hadn't been able to sleep past 5:30 and had run out of things to do at the apartment that didn't involve standing in the kitchen staring at the photograph of Elena. So he'd come in early and started on a backlogged maintenance ticket for a press calibration issue that had been waiting 10 days, and he'd been working steadily through it when his phone showed 7:42, and he set his tools down and waited. The first thing he heard was the quality of sound on the floor change, dramatically. Not the way floors change in movies, with people stopping mid-stride and turning. More like a temperature shift, a slight modulation in the ambient noise, the particular way a large sounds when many people are simultaneously reading something that has surprised them. He heard someone say something to someone else near the east corridor. He heard a door. He kept his eyes on the press calibration panel and did not look up. Graham came by at 7:55. He stood at the edge of the station and didn't say anything for a moment. "First line," Graham said finally. "Yeah. Original concept and prototype development, Caleb Mercer." Graham said it the way you repeat something to confirm it's real, with a footnote about Elena. "I know. Good footnote." "Yeah," Caleb said. "It is." Graham stood there another moment, doing the thing he did where he picked up an object from the bench and set it back down. This time it was a calibration chip. He set it back in exactly the right orientation, which was unconscious precision, which was just Graham being Graham. "Derek got his parking spot reassigned last week," Graham said. Caleb looked up at him. "I'm not saying that like it's justice," Graham said. "I'm just saying it happened and I noticed, and it seemed worth mentioning." Caleb looked back at the panel. "How do you know about his parking spot?" "I know things," Graham said, was not an answer, but was very much Graham. And he left. By mid-morning, the floor had returned to its normal register, but something in it had shifted in the specific way that happens when a piece of information has been absorbed into the general understanding of a place. People he knew nodded at him differently, with the exaggerated warmth that would have been uncomfortable, but with something more like recalibration, the slight adjustment in a person's face when they've revised their understanding of who they've been looking at. One of the floor supervisors, a woman named Val, who he'd worked alongside for 3 years without much direct conversation, stopped near his bench in the late morning and said, "That's a hell of a thing, Caleb," and he said, "Yeah," and she nodded and moved on, which was exactly the right exchange. He picked Sadie up at 3:58 and did not tell her about the announcement, because the announcement was his and it was significant, and he wanted to sit with it for a day before he translated it into a version for a 7-year-old. He made chicken and rice for dinner. He helped with a worksheet on compound words, which Sadie found more interesting than fractions, because the combinations could be unpredictable, and unpredictable things suited her temperament. Snowflake, toothbrush, starlight. She invented several that weren't real words, and he let her because the logic was defensible. He got her to bed. He sat at the kitchen table. He pulled the notebook, the first one, from January 2018, out of the box that Naomi had returned to him 2 days after the executive meeting, with a formal evidence process sticker on the side that he'd peeled off because it seemed wrong to have it there. He opened it to a random page, not looking for anything specific, just looking. Elena's red ink appeared on a calculation he'd done wrong the first time. A correction in her handwriting that was so the slight backward slant, the way she made her sevens with a horizontal bar across the middle because she'd learned it from her French-Canadian grandmother and never unlearned it, that looking at it was like hearing a very brief, very clear note of a voice. Check the lean angle coefficient again. I think you've got a sign error in the third line. And below it, in parentheses, also, you have coffee on your shirt. He sat with that for a while. He was still sitting there when his phone buzzed at 9:47. He looked at the screen. Brielle Sutton. He stared at it for a moment. She had his cell number because Naomi had provided it during the documentation process for administrative purposes. And she had apparently decided that 9:47 on Tuesday and a true time to use it. He answered, I hope this isn't too late, she said, which suggested she wasn't entirely sure it wasn't. It's fine, he said. I'm up. I wanted to know how the day landed, she said. For you. Not officially, I have the official version from comms. I wanted to know how it was actually. He thought about that for a second. Quiet, he said, which was what I needed it to be. People responded well to the announcement. I heard it changed a few expressions on the floor, he said. That's enough. A pause on the line. He could hear ambient sound on her end, not street noise exactly. More like a large, quiet space. Her office, he guessed, or wherever she was when she worked late, which, based on what he knew of her, was probably most places. Can I ask you something, she said. Sure. The notebook, she said, described them when she briefed me. All the material in them, how many were there? 6, he said. Over about 2 years. All with Elena's notes in them. Most of them, not all. The last 2 are mostly just mine, because by then she was... He stopped. She was sick in the last year. She was in and out of treatment. She still read everything, still corrected things, but she wasn't at the bench as much. The line was quiet for a moment. What was she treating? Brielle asked. She said it carefully, like someone who wasn't sure if the question was allowed, and was asking anyway. Brain tumor, he said. Diagnosed when Sadie was about 8 months old. She went through 2 rounds of treatment, and we thought, for a while, we really thought it was working. Then there was a car accident. He heard himself saying it, and it still had the quality, after 4 years, of a fact that the brain kept refusing to fully file. She was driving to a follow-up appointment. The accident wasn't her fault. The other driver ran a red light. He paused. She died at the scene. Caleb, Brielle said quietly. The motorcycle safety work was partly because of that, he said. She'd been thinking about it, about how many traffic fatalities were riders. She brought it to me as a project idea about 3 months after Sadie was born. She said someone should make it better, and I said she was right, and she said, well, it might as well be us. He looked at the open notebook on the table. That's how it started. Brielle didn't say anything for a moment. Yes, When she did, her voice had the specific quality of someone choosing words carefully, without wanting it to sound like they're choosing words carefully. The fund is going to matter, she said. I want you to know I mean that as more than a company commitment. The board has agreed to a 10-year funding guarantee, which Naomi is formalizing. Whatever Redwood's performance looks like in any given year, the fund's base allocation doesn't change. He hadn't known about the 10-year guarantee. Naomi hadn't mentioned it yet. Wasn't part of the original agreement, he said. No, Brielle said. I added it. He sat with that. Why? He said. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more the exhale of someone who's been asked to explain something they haven't fully explained to themselves yet. Because your wife spent the last year of her life sick and still writing correction notes in the margins of someone else's calculations, she said. Because she named a project and then didn't live to see it work and didn't get her name on it for 4 more years. 10 years of guaranteed funding seems like the absolute minimum. He closed the notebook. Thank you, he said. It came out plainly without any of the additional words that sometimes get added to a thank you to make it feel like enough. Just thank you, which was all he had that was honest. Get some sleep, she said. You've had a long week. It's Tuesday. I know, she said. That's what I mean. And when he set the phone, changed down. He noticed that the nearly smiling and sat with the strangeness of it for a moment before he closed the box and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The weeks that followed had a different texture than the months before them. Transformed, he'd been skeptical of transformation since Elena died, skeptical of the narrative that grief resolved into clarity, and clarity resolved into a better version of things. Life didn't work that way, in his experience. What actually happened was that things shifted by degrees, slowly enough that you sometimes missed the shift, and you looked back from some unremarkable Tuesday and realized the weight had redistributed without you noticing exactly when. The royalty payments began at the end of the quarter. The first one arrived as a direct deposit on a Friday morning, and he checked the number on his phone at 6:15 while the coffee ran and Sadie was still asleep. He set the phone down and picked it up again and looked at the number a second time, because the first time he hadn't quite believed it. He didn't change anything immediately. He paid 3 months of rent ahead, which was practical. He opened a savings account for Sadie with a specific purpose in mind that he hadn't told her about yet. He bought a good quality coffee maker for the kitchen because the old one had been dripping inconsistently for a year and a half and he'd been meaning to replace it, and now he could. He put the rest away. He did not buy a new motorcycle. He thought about it for exactly long enough to confirm it wasn't what he wanted, and then stopped thinking about it. What changed more than anything in those weeks was smaller and harder to name. It had to do with the way he moved through the workday, not with less diligence, but without the specific compression he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The awareness of what was under old Betty's seat, what was in the box under the bed, what was being built above him on executive floors, while he logged maintenance tickets. That particular low-frequency tension had been present for so long that its absence felt strange. He kept noticing it wasn't there. Graham noticed too, in the way Graham noticed things, which was without mentioning it directly. "You ate lunch outside on Wednesday," Graham said one morning, as though this was a data point requiring analysis. "It was warm," Caleb said. "It's been warm before. I'm just observing." "Observe quieter," Caleb said, and Graham went back to the east building looking. Caleb thought privately satisfied. Brielle came by the maintenance bay twice more in those weeks. The first time, she had an actual reason a facility review that Caleb later confirmed was a real scheduled review, which he'd felt slightly embarrassed for doubting. The second time, she brought 2 coffees in paper cups and set one on the edge of his workbench and said, "I was passing by," which was not a plausible thing to say about the maintenance bay, but which he chose to accept at face value. "How's the calibration issue on press 7? She asked. He looked at her. "I read maintenance logs," she said, without defensiveness. "The specific tickets, the aggregate reports. One of the presses has been a recurring item. Press 7's been throwing a torque calibration error, intermittently," he said. "I've replaced the sensor twice. I think it's the mounting bracket, which means a structural repair rather than a component swap. That's a longer fix." "Yeah. I put in the requisition last week." She nodded, holding her coffee cup with both hands, looking at the press from a distance with what appeared to be genuine attention. He watched her look at it and thought about the gap between the person who'd stood in the parking lot and made a careless remark and the person currently standing at his workbench drinking bad cafeteria coffee and asking about torque calibration errors. "What?" she said, catching him looking. "Nothing," he said. "You were thinking something. I was just noticing that you actually know what a torque calibration error is." She raised an eyebrow. "I grew up in a manufacturing company. I've been on these floors since I was 12. She paused. "My father thought operations knowledge was non-negotiable. He used to make me ride the forklifts on school holidays to prove I wasn't afraid of them." "Were you afraid of them?" "Terrified," she said. "But I learned to drive them." She drank her coffee. "He wasn't a soft man." "Is he?" she said. 7 years ago, I'm sorry." She looked at the press. "He built something real," she said. "That mattered to him more than most other things. I've spent 6 years trying to make sure it stayed real." She glanced at him. "Which is why what happened with your work bothers me on a level that goes past the legal problem." He would have been disgusted by it. Caleb didn't say anything. He also would have liked old Betty, she said. He had a thing for machines that were built for function rather than appearance. "Smart man," Caleb said. The corner of her mouth moved. She set her empty cup on the edge of the workbench. "I should get back. Thanks for the coffee," he said. "It's terrible coffee," she said. "It's not great," he agreed. She went back to the administrative building, and Caleb watched her go with the specific awareness of someone who is noticing something and choosing not to name it yet, because naming things prematurely had a way of either inflating them or frightening them off. And this, whatever this was, felt like something that deserved to develop at its own pace. The first time he saw her outside the context of Redwood dynamics was accidental. He was at the hardware store on a Saturday afternoon, Sadie in tow, looking for the specific grade of sandpaper he needed to refinish the step stool Gerald, who had developed a splinter situation on the top surface that Sadie found unacceptable. Sadie was pushing the small cart with the focused inefficiency of someone who understood the job, but found the straight line constraint deeply limiting. So the cart kept veering into the tool aisle, while he tried to stay in the finishing materials aisle, and he was mid-negotiation with her about cart trajectory when he heard someone say his name. No! He turned around. Brielle was at the end of the aisle, holding a package of replacement window weather stripping, wearing jeans and a plain navy pullover with a small paint stain on the left sleeve that he somehow found both surprising and completely unsurprising. "Hi," she said. She seemed very briefly caught off guard, which was so different from her usual register that it took him a second to read correctly. "Hi," he said. Sadie had redirected the cart and appeared at his side, looked at Brielle, and then looked up at Caleb with an expression that was entirely too evaluative for 7 years old. "This is Sadie," he said. "Hi, Sadie," Brielle said. Sadie studied her. "Are you from Dad's work?" "I am," Brielle said. "Are you the one who fixed the name thing?" Caleb closed his eyes briefly. "Sort of," Brielle said. "Your dad fixed it. I just helped make it official." Sadie seemed to find this an acceptable answer. She looked at the weather stripping. "What's that for?" "My windows are drafty," Brielle said. "Cold air gets in." "Our faucet drips," Sadie said, with the air of someone sharing a comparable household confidence. "Dad says it's character." "The faucet has character," Caleb clarified. "Not the drip." Brielle was looking at Sadie with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, attentive and slightly unguarded, the way people look at when they're genuinely rather than performatively charmed by them. "I like your jacket," Brielle said. It was the purple one, faded now from 2 years of weekly wear. "It's my favorite," Sadie said. "Purple is serious." "I completely agree," Brielle said. Sadie picked up the cart handle again and looked at her father. "Can we get the sandpaper?" "Gerald is suffering." "Gerald is the step stool," Caleb told Brielle. "I assumed," Brielle said. He found the sandpaper. They ended up at adjacent checkout lines, which, in a different context, might have felt forced, but in the specific environment of a hardware store on a Saturday afternoon, with Sadie narrating the contents of the conveyor belts. "Sandpaper? Sandpaper? More sandpaper. Why do we need 3 kinds?" Dad felt mostly just real. In the parking lot, Sadie walked ahead to where he'd parked the truck, Elena's old pickup, which he used for Saturdays because the sidecar wasn't practical for hardware runs, and Caleb and Brielle ended up walking at the same pace in the same direction for about 30 feet. "She's remarkable," Brielle said quietly. "She gets it from her mother," he said. "She gets some of it from you." He didn't argue with that. "Do you want to get coffee sometime?" she said. It came out slightly more direct than he suspected she'd intended, without the executive floor management she usually wrapped things in. He looked at her. "Not as a work thing," she said. "How that sounds, given the context." I'm asking because I'd like to, not because of anything else," he said. "Yeah, coffee sounds good." She nodded, with the expression of someone who'd expected to have to make a more complicated case, and was slightly surprised they didn't have to. "Okay," she said. "Not the cafeteria coffee," he said. "Obviously not the cafeteria coffee," she said. Sadie yelled from the truck that she'd found a granola bar in the glove compartment, and was it okay if she ate it? And he called back yes, and she disappeared back inside. He looked at Brielle. "Saturday works," he said. "I don't have her on the second Saturday of the month. She does an overnight at her friend Maya's." "If that second Saturday works," she said. He nodded. He walked to the truck. He drove home thinking about nothing specific, which was in itself slightly unusual. He was generally a man who filled his mental space efficiently, who moved from one practical consideration to the next without much idle running. But the drive home was quiet in his head, in a way that wasn't empty, more like a room that had just been straightened, finished, just organized enough to move around in. Sadie ate her granola bar and told him about a dream she'd had the previous night involving a very large cat who could speak Spanish, and he listened and asked the appropriate questions, and noted that the cat apparently had opinions about architecture. And by the time they got home, he was laughing for the second time in one day, which was a frequency he hadn't paid attention to until recently. He refinished Gerald's top surface in the afternoon. Sadie supervised with her rabbit and made several recommendations he didn't follow, and one he did. The step stool came out well, not perfect. One edge slightly rougher than the rest, because he'd run a little short on the fine grit paper, but solid and smooth enough that Sadie declared Gerald fully recovered, and patted the top with a kind of ceremonial finality. That evening after dinner he called his sister back in Portland, who he called every 2 or 3 weeks, a rhythm they'd settled into after Elena died, because she'd made it a point to be reachable, and he'd made it a point to actually call. Her name was Dana, and she was 4 years older, and she'd never been good at expressing things directly, but was excellent at listening, which was its own form of expression. "I might be getting coffee with someone," he said about 15 minutes into the call, during which he'd updated her on the patent situation in the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to describe a car repair. Dana had reacted to the patent story with the controlled fury of a person who wanted to say 17 things and was choosing the two most essential, which was characteristic. "Someone like a person," Dana said. "Yes, Dana, a person. From work. It's complicated. Is it a good complicated or a bad complicated?" He thought about it. "I'm not sure yet," he said honestly. "I think it might be the kind that's worth finding out." A pause on the line. He could hear her deciding what to say, the specific texture of his sister's thinking silences. "Okay," she said. "And then, is she good to Sadie?" He thought about the hardware store parking lot, the way Brielle had looked at his daughter with genuine attention. "She's remarkable," said quietly, without audience, meaning it. "We just met properly," he said, in an outside-of-work context, for about 8 minutes. But she told Sadie that purple is a serious color," he said, and Sadie immediately liked her. So, Dana made a sound that managed to convey both warmth and significant skepticism simultaneously, which was a skill she had honed over decades. "Sadie likes everybody." "Sadie does not like everybody," he said. "Sadie is extremely selective. She told Mrs. Patterson from next door that her perfume was too aggressive and she was 5 years old." Dana laughed, her real one, the one that came from the stomach. "Okay," she said. "Fair, keep me posted, I will." "And Caleb," she said. "Yeah, you're allowed to," she said, with ceremony, just plainly. "I know you know that. I just think it's worth saying out loud sometimes." He looked at the photograph on the counter. Elena laughing, Sadie on her chest, the world in the background, not knowing it was being documented. He said. He meant it. The coffee happened on the second Saturday of the following month, at a place 3 blocks from his apartment that he'd gone to occasionally for 2 years, but never with anyone. It had good coffee and corner booths and a deliberate absence of background music that either felt peaceful or oppressive, depending on who you were with. With Brielle, it felt peaceful. She was there when he arrived, which he hadn't expected. He'd assumed, based on every context he'd seen her in, that she'd be someone who made other people wait as a structural inevitability. But she was in the corner booth already, with a coffee she'd apparently ordered for herself, but not for him, which he found both correctly presumptuous and correctly polite. "You're early," he said. "I'm always early," she said. "I just usually have someone waiting who makes it look like I'm on time." He sat down. He ordered his coffee. The morning came through the front window at an angle that made the table warm, and the waitress recognized him and said, "The usual?" And he said yes, which was not complicated, but seemed to register with Brielle as something that mattered. "You're a regular," she said. "Creature of habit." "I never have regulars anywhere," she said. "I'm in a different place every week, usually a different city. Nothing gets familiar. Does that bother you?" She thought about it, which he appreciated the pause before answering. That indicated she was actually considering rather than just producing a rehearsed response. "Sometimes," she said. "Less than it used to. I've been in this city long enough now that it's starting to feel like mine." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Redwood's been here for 30 years. My father built it here. I used to feel like a visitor in my own company. And now, I think I've earned the city," she said. Which sounds arrogant. "It sounds like someone who did the work," he said. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You do that," she said. "What?" "Give people the more generous interpretation of what they just said. You do it in meetings too, I've noticed it. Someone says something defensive or half-formed, and you respond to what they meant rather than what they said." He considered this. "Probably because I've had people do the opposite," he said. "It's not usually more useful." She was quiet a moment. Outside, a woman walked past the window with a small dog, who was clearly having opinions about the direction of the walk. And they both noticed it at the same time, and the moment had that particular quality of two people accidentally sharing something small and unremarkable, and not making a thing of it. "Can I ask about Elena?" she said. "You don't have to. You can ask," he said. "What was she like?" He looked at his coffee for a moment, stalling, just letting the answer have its actual weight before he put it into words. "Specific," he said. "That's the word I'd use first. She had precise opinions about everything: food, music, how things should be done, what mattered and what didn't. She wasn't difficult about it. She just knew what she thought." He paused. "She was funnier than me, better at talking to people cold, walking into a room of strangers. She never found that hard. I always find that hard." He looked up. "She took engineering as seriously as I did, but she never let it become the only thing. She was good at keeping proportion. I had to learn that." A pause. "I'm still learning it. She sounds like someone I would have liked," Brielle said. "She would have had strong opinions about you," he said. "Good or bad? Complicated," he said. "She respected people who knew what they were doing. She had less patience for people who performed competence instead of having it." He looked at her. "She would have respected you, and she would have given you a hard time about the parking lot thing."
"No."
Brielle's mouth curved. "For a long time?" "Moderate duration," he said. "She was direct but not cruel. She would have made her point and moved on." "That seems fair." "She was very fair," he said. And then, because it was still true and he'd stopped trying to qualify it, "I miss her a lot." Brielle didn't try to fill that. She let it sit in the conversation where it belonged, which was the right thing to do, and the fact that she knew it was the right thing to do told him something about her. They stayed in the booth for 2 hours, which was an hour and 15 minutes longer than Caleb had expected. They talked about the company, and they talked about Sadie, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with either a book she'd read on a flight 3 months ago that she was still thinking of, the specific way Portland winters were different from winters. Here, the structural integrity problems with Press 7, which they had both strong opinions about, and reached the same conclusion on independently, which made them both laugh. He walked her to her car, which was parked 2 blocks away. The air was cool and clear in the specific way of late autumn mornings when the sky hasn't made its mind up yet, and they walked at a comfortable pace that was neither rushed nor deliberate. At her car, she stopped and turned to face him. "This was good," she said. "It was," he said. "I'd like to do it again," she said. "Straightforward." "Yeah," he said. "Me too." She nodded. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment after she pulled out, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the space she'd vacated with no particular urgency. He walked the 3 blocks home in the clear morning, past the hardware store where they'd met accidentally and the diner where he'd eaten grilled cheese after leaving Naomi's office the first time, and the school where Sadie had once announced to her entire class that her father invented something. Yes, he'd intervened, important, which she'd told him about afterward with the confidence of someone reporting a known fact, and he'd had to explain that it was complicated, and she'd said most things worth knowing were, which was not something a 7-year-old should have been able to say so correctly, but which had not entirely surprised him. Because she was, in that way, and in many others, her mother's daughter. Let himself into the apartment. The coffee maker he'd bought with the first royalty payment was warm on the counter. The step stool stood solid and smooth by the sink. The drawings on the refrigerator had been reorganized. At some point, Sadie must have done it before she left for Maya's, and a new one was at the center, taped slightly crooked, which showed 4 figures that he looked at for a long moment before his brain fully parsed the composition. A tall one with a helmet next to a motorcycle, a small one with a purple blob for a jacket, a rabbit, and to the right of the small one, slightly separate but included in the same drawing, a 4th figure with dark hair that Sadie had drawn with careful attention to the specific detail of a paint stain on one sleeve. He stood in the kitchen, looking at the drawing for a while. Then he poured his coffee and sat at the table and looked at it some more, and outside the parking lot was quiet, and old Betty Elizabeth Mercer stood in her usual spot under the sodium light, carrying nothing in particular today, which was its own kind of good. The launch event was scheduled for a Thursday in late November, which meant the city had gone gray and cold in the particular way it did when autumn finally stopped pretending and became something else. Redwood Dynamics had booked a venue downtown, a converted industrial space that someone in marketing had decided communicated both heritage and innovation, which Caleb thought was exactly the kind of logic that produced spaces nobody was entirely comfortable in, but nobody could argue with either. He wasn't going. That had been his decision from the beginning, stated once to Naomi and not revisited. The launch was for investors and journalists and the industry people who cared about product reveals, and Caleb was not any of those things. He had been invited formally, with his name on the invitation in a font that suggested the invitation itself was an event, and he had declined politely, and without extended explanation, because the explanation was simple. Thursday was a school day, and 4 o'clock was 4 o'clock, and he didn't make exceptions to 4 o'clock. Had accepted this without argument. Brielle had been less immediate about it. "You built the thing," she'd said, 2 weeks earlier, over coffee at the same corner booth that had become their place by default. "No," through repetition rather than declaration. "Your name is on the presentation first line." "I know," he said. "You don't want to be there when they say it out loud in a room full of people." He thought about it genuinely, which was the honest answer he'd thought about it before she asked. He said, "I don't need the room. I needed the name on the documentation. I needed the fund. I needed the room to know it was wrong." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "I don't need to watch people applaud something and then go to a reception dinner. That's not what this was about." She looked at him with the expression she had when she was processing something that didn't fit the model she'd been working from. "People," she said slowly, "spend years fighting for recognition, and when they get it, they want to stand in the room and feel it. I'm not most people," he said. "Not with ego, just as a fact." She said, "You're genuinely not." So on the Thursday of the launch, Caleb woke at 5:42. He made coffee. He packed Sadie's lunch peanut butter and honey, crusts off, apple slices, pretzels. He tied her shoes with the double knot and dropped her at school at 8:15 and was at his bench at Redwood by 7:40, running a diagnostic on the Press 7 mounting bracket that had finally been approved for structural repair. The floor had an unusual energy that day, people moving slightly differently, conversations slightly lower, the particular atmospheric quality of a building aware that something important, is happening somewhere else with its name on it. Several people stopped by his bench through the morning. Val, the floor supervisor, brought him a coffee from the decent machine on the second floor, not the cafeteria one, without saying anything about why. Graham appeared at 10 and stood at the edge of his station for a full minute in silence before saying, "It's a good day," and going back to the East building. He thought that was probably right. It was a good day. Around 11, his phone showed him a news alert, Redwood Dynamics launch coverage, a trade publication he'd never read. Headline about the adaptive torque distribution system being a potential industry standard. He read the first paragraph and then put his phone away and went back to the mounting bracket. The alert had included one detail he'd been curious about, without being able to admit he was curious, the presentation slide. A journalist had photographed it. He'd seen it for the 1 second before he put the phone down. But 1 second, enough. White background. The motorcycle clean and new. Technical specifications in a column on the right. And at the bottom, in text that was smaller than the headline, but larger than a footnote, clearly intentional. Original concept and prototype Caleb Mercer. Early theoretical development Elena Mercer. He put his phone in his pocket and stood at his bench and did not do anything for about 30 seconds. Then he picked up his wrench and finished the mounting bracket. He picked Sadie up at 3:58. She had paint on both hands from an art project and a complicated story about a disagreement with a boy named Oliver over the correct way to draw a horse, which she felt strongly Oliver had gotten wrong. "Did you tell him?" Caleb asked. "I told him horses' legs don't bend that way," she said. "He said they do sometimes." "What did you say?" "I said, 'Show me one photograph,'" Sadie said with the serene authority of someone who knows they are correct and is content to let the evidence speak. "Good response," Caleb said. "I know," she said. She looked at her paint-covered hands. "Is this going to come off?" "With soap." "Good. Because Margaret doesn't deserve paint on her." "Margaret the dish rack." "Right." They stopped at the grocery store. Sadie chose cereal, not the cartoon one this time, a different box. because she'd apparently decided she was too old for the cartoon one, which she announced with the gravity of someone making a constitutional amendment. He bought pasta and tomatoes and a bunch of bananas and a newspaper he didn't need, and they drove home in the early dark of November, old Betty's headlight cutting through it in the specific, competent way it always had. That evening he made pasta. Sadie set the table, including a place for her rabbit, which remained a non-negotiable feature of meals in the Mercer household. They ate, and she told him more about Oliver's horse problem, and then about a book she was reading where a girl discovered a door in her house that hadn't been there before. And Caleb ate his pasta and listened with the full attention he always gave her, which was not an effort, had never been an effort. So, because she was the most interesting person he knew, and always had been. After dinner, after dishes, Gerald, Margaret. The whole infrastructure after homework and bath, and the reading under the blanket negotiation that he won this time by agreeing to read 2 chapters of The Door in the House book aloud after the light was finally off, and Sadie's breathings had settled into the specific rhythm that meant she was actually asleep rather than planning something. Caleb sat at the kitchen table. He opened his laptop, which he used rarely enough that it had updated 17 times, while he wasn't looking, and took 4 minutes to complete the process. It finally settled. He searched the launch coverage. There was a lot of it. Trade publications, motorcycle industry sites, one mainstream tech outlet that had covered it because the safety angle crossed over. Yes, he'd read through several articles without reading carefully, skimming for the thing he was actually looking for. He found it in the third article, a moderately well-written piece from an industry journal whose journalist had apparently been thorough enough to notice what other journalists had skimmed past. The launch presentation opened with a technical overview of the ATD system. What caught several attendees' attention was a detail at the bottom of the first slide, an attribution line crediting the original concept and prototype to Caleb Mercer, and early theoretical development to Elena Mercer. Sutton, when asked about the attribution during the post-presentation Q&A, gave an answer that was notably direct for a product launch. Getting that right was more important than the launch date, she said. We should have gotten it right 4 years ago. We didn't. The slide is one part of making that right. When asked who Caleb Mercer was, Sutton said, a member of a team who did the foundational work on this technology while raising a daughter alone after losing his wife. His name belongs on it. So does hers. He read that paragraph twice. He sat with it. He thought about Brielle standing in a room full of investors and journalists and industry people, with every incentive to give a smooth non-answer about attribution and legacy and the collaborative nature of innovation, and instead saying his name belongs on it. So does hers. Not as a prepared line, he could tell the difference between a prepared line and something a person actually meant, and she meant it. He closed the laptop. He looked at the photograph of Elena on the counter. Elena laughing, Sadie against her chest, the world behind them, not knowing it was being remembered. She said your name out loud in a room, he said to the photograph, in front of a lot of people. He was not entirely sure what Elena would have said back to that, but he had a reasonable guess, and it would have involved the word finally and possibly something about the coffee machine, because she'd always thought his old one was inadequate, and she'd been right about that too, as she'd been right about most things. He went to bed. He slept well for the first time in what felt like a long string of nights that had been technically sufficient, but not quite restful. He slept the way people sleep when something that has been unresolved for a long time has finally resolved, and the body, which keeps score of these things more accurately than the mind, decides it can let go. In the weeks after the launch, the world turned to its norm, which was one of the better things about normal. It always came back. The press coverage cycled through and was replaced by other press coverage about other things. No, the Elena Mercer Road Safety Fund received its first formal grant applications in early spring, 3 months ahead of the original timeline because the response had been larger than projected. Naomi called to tell him. How many applications? He asked. 87, she said, in the first 2 weeks. Mostly individual engineers, some small university teams. One woman in Ohio who's been developing a rain-sensing brake modulation system out of her garage for 3 years with her own money. He was quiet for a moment. Make sure her application gets a full review, he said. Every application gets a full review, Naomi said, with the particular tone she used when she wanted him to know that went without saying. He said, I just wanted to say it. He sat on the board's first review panel as the applications were evaluated. The panel included Naomi, 2 independent engineers, a road safety researcher from the state university, and a woman named Carmen who had lost her son to a motorcycle accident 8 years ago and who had been involved in road safety advocacy ever since. Carmen said almost nothing during the first 2 hours of the panel, and then, when the discussion reached the garage engineer from Ohio, said, "This is exactly who this fund should exist for." And that was the most important thing said in the room all day, and everyone knew it. The Ohio engineer's name was Patricia. Her brake modulation system was awarded a first-round development grant. She sent a handwritten letter to the fund's administrative address that Naomi scanned and forwarded to Caleb, which he read at his bench and then folded and put in his jacket pocket and did not take out for the rest of the day. That evening, he showed it to Brielle. They were at his kitchen table, which had become a thing that happened with a frequency. Neither of them had explicitly planned she'd come by after work, or on weekends, initially with specific purposes and increasingly without them. She'd fixed the dripping faucet the third time she came over, which had involved going back to the hardware system, and which Sadie had supervised with the same authority she brought to all things technical in the household, which was complete. The faucet had not dripped since. Sadie had declared this one of the top 5 events of recent months, ranking it just below the horse disagreement resolution, which Caleb felt was a reasonable placement. Brielle read the letter from Patricia in Ohio. She read it without speaking. When she finished, she set it down on the table and didn't say anything for a moment. She says Usaina's name in the second paragraph, Brielle said. She read about the fund's origin, Caleb said. The article in the safety journal mentioned the background. Brielle looked at the letter again. She says she didn't think there was a fund like this for people doing exactly what she was doing. She says she'd started to think maybe she was, I'm paraphrasing, maybe she was foolish for continuing. Yeah, Caleb said. She was going to stop, Brielle said. And now she's not going to stop, Brielle said. She said it like she was arriving at something, not stating something she already understood. Because Elena, she stopped. Because we put the work in a garage at 2 a.m. Yeah, and because someone corrected the record, and because the money goes somewhere real, Caleb said. Yeah. Brielle looked up at him. He'd gotten better over the months at reading her face, at distinguishing between the controlled public version and the more inhabited private one. This was the private one, the version without the managed calm. And what was in it right now was something he recognized. Because it had moved through him at different moments over the past year, the specific quality of feeling the weight of something correctly for the first time. Are you okay? He asked. I'm good, she said. I'm better than I expected to be at this stage of this year, which is a strange thing to realize. He understood that. The year had started with her learning that a foundational technology in her company had been built on a theft, and that she'd presided over the company while it happened. That was not a small thing to carry. Note, she'd carried it without making it someone else's prob he'd noticed and which had mattered to him. You handled it right, he said. After you knew. I handled it right after I knew, she said. The bar could be higher. Sure, he said. The bar can always be higher. But you're holding a letter from a woman in Ohio who almost gave up, and she didn't, and some of that is because of what you did after you knew. She looked at the letter. Some of it, she said. Some of it, he agreed. Elena gets credit for the rest. Brielle smiled, and it was the real one, the one that had started appearing more frequently in his kitchen and his corner booth, and the passenger seat of Elena's pickup on the 2 or 3 occasions she'd been there. Yes, he'd intervened, the one that had nothing to do with managing a room or producing an impression. She'd told him once, somewhat reluctantly, that she'd spent so many years learning how to present herself in rooms that she'd gotten slightly confused about what she was actually like when the room was empty. He'd said he was the wrong person to help her figure that out, because he'd only ever known her when the room was more or less empty. She'd said that was probably why it was easier. He'd thought about that more than once since. Sadie came in from the hallway in her pajamas, which meant it was past 8, and she'd been put to bed and had decided the situation in the kitchen required investigation. You're supposed to be asleep, Caleb said. I was going to be, Sadie said. But I thought of something. What did you think of? She looked at Brielle. Did you come to dinner? Because we have leftover pasta. I ate already, Brielle said. But thank you. The pasta is good, Sadie said with the tone of someone making a genuine case. Dad puts the cheese on top that gets a little brown. That's the best kind, Brielle said. Sadie seemed satisfied with this answer. She stood in the doorway for another moment, taking in the kitchen in the way she took in rooms she'd left, checking that it matched what she'd left, which it did. She looked at the table and noticed the letter. What's that? A letter, Caleb said, from someone who got a grant from Mom's fund. Sadie came over and looked at it without touching it. She could read it. Mostly she was above her grade level in reading, which her teacher had mentioned twice in the past year with some emphasis. She read the relevant parts with her finger moving slightly along the lines. She says Elena, Sadie said. She does, Caleb said. Sadie straightened up. She thought about this for a moment, with the particular gravity she brought to things that were both good and complicated. Mom would have liked that, she said. Being in a letter. Yeah, Caleb said. She would have. Sadie nodded. The matter settled to her satisfaction. Okay, she said. I'm going to sleep now. Good. She looked at Brielle. Night. Good night, Sadie, Brielle said. Sadie went back down the hallway. They heard her door close, then the specific sound of her getting back into bed and then quiet. No. Caleb and Brielle sat at the kitchen table in that quiet. She's going to be something, Brielle said. She said it the way people say things they don't doubt. She already is something, Caleb said. The kitchen was warm and the new coffee maker was doing the thing where it made a small settling sound as it cooled, and the photograph of Elena was on the counter, and Gerald stood by the sink, and Margaret the dish rack held 3 plates and 2 cups, and a small bowl that had been part of Sadie's dinner, and that Sadie had rinsed and placed there with her characteristic precision about things she considered important. Was nothing wrong with the moment. That was the thing Caleb was still learning to recognize, not moments of great dramatic rightness, but the ordinary unannounced moments that contained something he had no better word for than enough. Elena had always been better at recognizing them in real time. He'd had to learn by losing her. Brielle reached across the table and picked up the letter and folded it carefully along its original creases and slid it back across to him. Can I ask you something? She said. You always ask that before you ask, he said. You don't have to. Habit, she folded her hands. When you decided to stop waiting on Derek, stop waiting for it to be handled, what actually changed, because 4 years is a long time to wait, and then something tips. He thought about it. Not to construct an answer, but because it was a real question and deserved the real answer. Graham put the folder on my bench, he said, and I read it and saw that they were about to file. And I thought if they file and it goes through, then it's not just that my name isn't on it. It's permanently not on it, and Elena's work is permanently not on it. And Sadie's going to grow up, and someday someone might tell her that her mother contributed to something important. And technically, officially, according to the documents, she didn't. He paused. I could carry a lot of things. I couldn't carry that. Brielle was quiet. It was for Sadie, she said. It was for Sadie, he said. And for Elena. And he stopped, then decided to finish it. And for me. Eventually it was for me too. Because you have to decide at some point that what you built is worth your own name. She looked at him steadily. It took you a while to get to the last part, she said. He said, It did. What got you there? He thought about the conference room, the box on the table, Naomi reading Elena's annotations. He thought about the parking lot, the cold morning, Sadie's shoelace. He thought about sitting at this table with the legal pad and writing Naomi Pierce's name at the top and beginning to list what he had. I got tired, he said simply, of being the person who knew and said nothing. I had a reason for a while, and then the reason got smaller, and the silence got heavier, and eventually they crossed. He looked at the photograph of Elena. She would have told me to do it years earlier, by the way. She had a lower tolerance for injustice than I did. I believe that completely, Brielle said. They sat there a little longer. He made tea, because it was late enough for tea rather than coffee, and she stayed because she wasn't in a hurry, which was one of the things that had shifted about her over the months. She'd stopped manufacturing reasons to leave. Yes, he'd noticed and not commented on because it was one of those things that said itself more clearly in the doing than in anything either of them could have said about it. At some point she asked if he'd thought about whether he'd ever go back to engineering, at Redwood specifically, in general. He sat with the question. Think about it sometimes, he said. Less than I expected to after all this. I thought getting the recognition back would make me want the career back. He turned his cup in his hands. But the maintenance work, I know, it looks like a step down. It looks like someone who settled. And for a long time I let people think that because I didn't have the energy to explain the alternative. He looked at his hands. The truth is I'm good at it. I like fixing things that are broken. I like knowing that when I go home the thing I fixed is still fixed. I like that Sadie knows where I'll be at 4 o'clock. That's not settling, Brielle said. I know that now, he said. It took a while. She looked at him with the expression she'd developed over months of knowing him, the one that was attentive without being intrusive. The engineering isn't gone, she said. It went somewhere. He thought about the fund, Patricia in Ohio, the grant panel, Carmen's voice in the review room saying this is exactly who this fund should exist for. He said, it went somewhere better. Outside the apartment, the city was quiet with the specific quiet of a November night when the temperature has finally dropped below the pretending threshold and everything is just cold, straightforwardly, and without apology. Old Betty was in the parking lot under the sodium light. Her paint the same worn paint it had always been. Her chrome, the oxidized chrome, her sidecar at the same characteristic slight angle. She was not a beautiful motorcycle. She had never been. She was a machine that had been built to test something, and then had become something's proof, and then had carried a man and his daughter through 4 years of a life that had cost them things, and then had carried evidence of an injustice that needed correcting, and then had been corrected. She'd done all of that without a new paint job or a restored chrome finish or any of the things people did to machines when they wanted them to look like more than they were. She looked like what she was. Caleb had always respected that about her. On a Sunday in late November, the three of them were outside in the parking lot, Caleb doing a routine check on old Betty's engine, which he did every 6 weeks without exception, Sadie sitting in the sidecar for no reason, other than that the sidecar was there, and she fit in it, Brielle leaning against the wall with a coffee in her hand watching, in the way she'd learned to watch when something mechanical was happening, which was with genuine attention rather than performative interest. Sadie had her hand resting on the fuel tank. She was looking at it the way she looked at things she'd been thinking about for a while. Dad, she said, yeah. You know how everyone's going to want to see Redwood's new motorcycle because it's beautiful and expensive? She patted the tank once. But this is the one that showed them where to go. He looked up from the engine. She wasn't being poetic. She was 7 3/4, and she was stating something she'd worked out on her own, the way she worked out most things, through a combination of listening carefully and thinking for longer than anyone expected her to. He looked at Brielle. Brielle was looking at Sadie with the expression that had no public version, that was only for the kitchen and the parking lot and the corner booth, for the small exact circle of things that were hers rather than the company's. He looked back at old Betty, then at Sadie with her hand on the tank and her rabbit tucked under her other arm, matter-of-fact and completely certain. Yes, then at Brielle, who caught him looking and didn't look away, which was something she'd stopped doing sometime in the past several months, that small specific thing, not looking away, which communicated something neither of them had felt the need to say yet, because the not saying was also a form of saying. He put the wrench down. That's exactly right, he said. Sadie nodded. She'd known. The afternoon was gray and cold, and the parking lot was unremarkable, and the coffee in Brielle's cup had probably gone cold, and Sadie's rabbit was, as always, participating in an event he hadn't been formally invited to, but which he attended anyway, because that was his nature. And Caleb Mercer stood in a parking lot in November, beside a motorcycle that had never been beautiful, that had carried his name when his name was nowhere else, that had carried his daughter every school day for 4 years, that had outlasted everything that had tried to erase what it held. He thought about Elena at the bench in January with the red pen and the 7 with the horizontal bar and the smiley face in the margins. He thought about a system running clean for the first time at 2 in the morning and Elena's voice saying, there it is. He thought about Graham putting a folder on a workbench. He thought about a box under a bed for 4 years, patient and complete. He thought about Naomi reading every page. He thought about Brielle in a room full of investors saying his name belongs on it. So does hers. He thought about Patricia in Ohio, who almost stopped. He thought about Sadie saying, "Show me one photograph," about Oliver's horse, with that serene certainty, which was running forward in a purple jacket into a future that Elena had helped build without living to see. He was not a sentimental man. He'd been too busy and too tired and too practically focused for most of his 4 years to afford sentiment. But there were moments, not the dramatic ones, the small exact ones where the weight of what had actually happened was visible in the right light, and you could see it clearly, and you understood that the visible things weren't the whole story. Most of what mattered had moved through ordinary days, packed lunches and double-knot shoelaces and maintenance tickets and red ink in the margins of notebooks that nobody saw for years, and that the ordinary days were the story, not the interruptions to it. He picked up his wrench. He finished the check. He closed old Betty's engine panel and ran his hand along the top of the fuel tank once, the way you touch something you know. "Inside?" he said. "Inside." Sadie confirmed, climbing out of the sidecar with her rabbit, pushed off the wall. "I can make coffee," she said. "Better than what's left in this cup." "You don't know where anything is," he said. "Where everything is," she said. "I've been here enough times." He looked at her. That was probably true. She probably did know where everything was. In the kitchen, with the dripping faucet that no longer dripped, and the step stool named dish rack, and the photograph on the counter, and the drawings on the refrigerator, including the one with 4 figures. One of them with dark hair and a paint stain on the sleeve. "Fair enough," he said. They went inside. The door closed behind them. In the parking lot, old Betty sat under the sodium light in the November cold, the same as she'd always been, worn and oxidized and real, carrying nothing today except her own history, which was considerable, and the hand-stamped initials under the seat that said C, and a date in January, and the simple fact of something built by people who believed it mattered. She'd been right to believe it. It had.